crime that people do over their computers. Crime overall across the world is changing. Our response must change commensurate to that and make sure we take the very most effective action. That's part of that is this spending review commitment that has just been made, along with the new economic crime levy, which represents an additional £400 million over this spending review period.
For 5, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, in advance of the recent irresponsible and self-defeating protests, there has been regular engagement with the police, local authorities and industry to ensure that these protests can be managed effectively and there is no risk to fuel supply. All fuel supply points are fully operational and we will continue to work closely with the police and industry to ensure that supplies are maintained.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister agree that while the right to protest is a fundamental liberty, this type of behaviour just infuriates the public, who we need to get on side in terms of our net zero campaign, and it is particularly unfair to the self-employed, who, if they can't get fuel for their vehicles, they can't get to work and they don't get paid? And will he make sure that the police and the law stay on the side of the law-abiding so everyone can earn an income?
Speaker, I certainly will ensure that that is the case, and the honourable gentleman is quite right to point out the impact, particularly on those who rely on their vehicles for their work, of these, as I said, irresponsible and self-defeating protests, many of which have been extremely dangerous. But it's worth also reflecting on the other impact, Mr. Speaker, which is that hundreds of police officers are pulled away from policing neighbourhoods across the UK because of mutual aid. We brought police from as far away as Scotland and the South West and Wales to help with dealing with these protests, and that has a direct impact on the levels of crime in all of our constituencies, notwithstanding the fact that we are all committed environmentalists and want to see lower use of fossil fuels. This is not the way to achieve it.
Julie Elliott.
Number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Easter saw Border Force maintain a secure and effective border with minor inbound border control disruption in what was one of the highest periods of international travel during the past 2 years. Before Easter, February and March 2022 saw over 85% of queue measurements under 45 minutes for non-EU passengers.
Thank Minister.
And with 24. Your permission and prompting, Mr. Speaker, thank you. I'll do together with 24.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that response. I have recently written to the Minister regarding the experience the Collins family, constituents of mine, have had at Newcastle Airport returning from holiday at 11:15 at night a week or two ago. The family are, the father is a British-born citizen, their mother has settled status as of German origin. The children are both British citizens and German. The experience they had at the airport from Border Force, where they were not allowing the little boy Nico, who is 5 years old, into the country, they described as hostile, unpleasant and unsympathetic manner. That's not the way one should be treated by Border Force, certainly not a 5-year-old child. The child had his German passport. His British passport was waiting at home, and on showing that an email had been received to say that they were eventually allowed in. So a 5-year-old child was eventually allowed in as a British citizen to his home. What has the Minister to say? I think an urgent investigation is required and an unreserved apology to the Commons.
Well, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Lady for bringing this to the floor of the Commons. And I am, of course, sorry for any such experience and for any distress caused to a family, in particular to a child so young. She will understand, I know, that it's very difficult for me at the dispatch box to talk about a particular case without having all the facts available, but I would, of course, be happy to follow up with her separately.
Dame Caroline Damage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It appears that travellers are not only experiencing severe delays at passport control, but also with processing passport applications and renewals in the first place. While I fully understand that the Minister has set out the pressures that staff are facing, can he please reassure me that backlogs will be addressed and airport issues sorted out before my constituents go on their summer holidays?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do want to reassure my friend that, I mean, in spite of that, there has been this surge in demand, as she would expect, considering the patterns that we've seen over the past couple of years, and now with international travel return. This is absolutely something that my honourable friend, who leads on passport issuing, is across, and making sure that the necessary capacity is there.
Cabré.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Passport delays are impacting on our constituents' ability to take holidays and take up jobs abroad, ever lengthening queues at passport control, and now generous constituents signing up for the Homes for Ukraine scheme having their first experience of the Home Office's chaos. When will the Home Secretary realise that the impact her department's appalling record is having in managing the gateways into and out of our country is having on the UK's reputation here and across the world?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I take extremely seriously the experience that passengers have coming through British airports and indeed seaports. There is a distinction between outbound and inbound. When we talk about, there really is. When we talk about, if we're talking about border force and passport control, that is about inbound. And as I was saying in my earlier answer to her honourable friend, it is the case. There are times when queues grow, and I don't like to see that happen. Sometimes it's because of factors beyond our control, like so-called flight bunching, where lots of flights arrive together or flights are late. But I know that Border Force are working extremely hard to try and project demand as best they can and to make sure that the staffing is there and taking very considerable measures to match up to it.
Virginia Crosby.
Question 7, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'd like to group this question with question 16. Border Force officers work tirelessly on not just securing our borders, but also on doing all sorts of security work, safeguarding our borders, but also intercepting illicit goods, counterfeit goods at airports and at sea, covering over 140 major sea and airports across the UK. But, Mr. Speaker, I've also commissioned an independent review of Border Force to identify ways in which this review can help improve its operations.
Virginia Crosby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My Honest-Morn constituents are concerned about illegal immigration. Can my right honourable friend thank Border Force, which has seen an increase in its staff in Holyhead from 20 to 60 for its work? And can she reassure those across Anglesey that this government remains committed to giving refuge to all those that need it, while acting compassionately and swiftly to remove those who do not?
Right.
Honourable friend, the member for Honest-Mons, is absolutely right, and I too have seen the work that is underway and the teams do at Holyhead, which is incredible on many fronts, both passenger but also on commercial work as well. She's right to highlight the issue of illegal migration, the work the Border Force do on that. The House has discussed some of that today as well. But also, the fact is Holyhead is the second busiest port in the UK, and as a result of Brexit, the team has expanded. She will know that. She's met them, along with myself, from 20 to 60, meaning more skilled local jobs for her constituents.
Andrew Rosner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend assure me that as the government rightly helps those most in need from Ukraine, it will continue to make the security of the British public a priority through the use of biometrics and other security checks for refugees entering the United Kingdom?
My friend is absolutely right in his question and the points that he makes. First and foremost, we have security checks for very good reasons. That is about the domestic safety of our homeland, but at the same time as well, he will be aware of the work that's underway on digitalisation of our borders. That is part of the Britain post-Brexit Global Britain work that has taken place. And in fact, all ministers are heavily involved, not just from the Home Office, but the Cabinet Office in that work.
Duncan Baker.
Number 8, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the government takes this issue extremely seriously. We're taking a range of actions, including reclassifying GHB and related substances from Class C to Class B drugs under the Misuse of Drugs Act. These are the so-called date-rape drugs which have been used in drug-facilitated crime. And, of course, we're also looking at considering the case for a specific criminal offence to target spiking, should it be required.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've had a constituent get in touch with me who's had the dreadful problem of having her drink spiked. It's been a dreadfully traumatic experience, but on top of that, it's left her in a situation where she no longer can go out and socialise with her friends because of the anxiety it's caused. What specifically can I ask about with tougher sentencing we can introduce, but also preventative measures to stop this dreadful crime ever happening again?
Well, my honourable friend is right. Drink spiking, or needle spiking, does have a very serious impact, and I fully understand the anxiety of his constituents. And of course, all our hearts go out to her, and I very much hope she will take some reassurance from the funding that the government's provided to the Norfolk Police and Crime Commissioner. He's been granted £427,000 for a range of practical initiatives designed to keep women safe on the streets at night, including drink spiking kits, taxi marshals, street pastors and more. And also, I'm sure his constituent will be pleased to know that there are already a range of offences under which people can be imprisoned, and some do attract a life sentence, Mr. Speaker.
Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the pandemic period, over 5 million people delayed applying for a British passport. This has led to unprecedented passport demand currently, yet to meet this we have also increased output to unprecedented levels as well. Since April 2021, HMPO has introduced a range of contingency measures, including technical improvements and bolstering its resources. And this has helped to deliver record output, with the processing of over 1 million applications being completed last month alone.
Graham Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But my experience can't be unique. I think it's echoed by other members in the House. This Easter, families and children in my constituency have lost holidays due to the Passport Office failing to meet its service standards at times. In telephone communications with the Passport Office, myself and my staff have been misadvised, hung up on, received a series of broken promises. Now, MPs once had valuable and effective links with the Passport Office to resolve complaints, notwithstanding the contribution of the Home Office PPSs, and I thank them for their interventions. Why can't I deal with my local excellent Durham Passport Office to resolve complaints instead of waiting for hours on so-called bespoke MP hotlines and failing to make progress?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd probably just point out that between January and March, over 90% of cases were completed within 6 weeks, but we do advise people to allow up to 10 weeks before making an application. But again, we are getting through, and I recognise the points he makes about the MP's contact, and so that's a point that we will pick up, and I'm very happy we do need to make improvements to it.
Please, spokesperson Stuart C. MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm afraid the honourable gentleman is certainly not alone. All our constituents are having to cancel holidays, miss funerals, rearrange visits, with even the new 10-week target routinely being failed. So what will be done to avoid this predictable mess getting worse? And can we be assured that the 10-week target will not be lengthened further as we approach the summer?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first, in terms of, I go back to the fact that we issued a million passport applications last month alone. To put it into context, we usually deal with 7 million in a whole year. I would point out that where people have compelling and compassionate circumstances, such as a funeral, their applications can be expedited, and it has now been, for some time, we've been advising to allow up to 10 weeks for an application to be processed, and last year sent 4.7 million texts reminding people whose passports had expired to renew them. But no, we don't have any intention to further extend that standard. We are at the moment processing most passports well within it, but we would advise people this is a virtually unprecedented surge in demand, and if people are planning travel this summer, we would advise them to get their application in as soon as possible.
Simon Hall.
Mr. Speaker, unprecedented, true, but foreseeable, absolutely should have been done. I hear what the Minister has said. Certainly my constituents are telling me their experience is either really, really very good or it's an absolute shambles. But I agree with what the honourable gentleman who raised the question in the first instance said. There needs to be a better interface between Members of Parliament and the Passport Office when those constituents, either through family funeral reasons or for holiday or business reasons, are not getting through, are then being lied to by officials. When they do get through, something needs to be done to arrest this, and quickly.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments. I would say, to give a background, early in January we were processing about 60,000 passports a week, and by mid-March we'd nearly trebled and actually nearly quadrupled the output of the service. But I agree with him and the points earlier made that we do need to review the performance of the hotline for MPs, particularly where there are compelling and compassionate circumstances behind expediting an application.
Number 10, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Part 2 of the Nationality and Borders Bill defines the key provisions of the Refugee Convention. In developing this policy, we have considered factors such as the law in other jurisdictions, case law and academic works. All provisions of the bill, as well as our current asylum policy framework, are a good faith, effective and compatible interpretation of the Refugee Convention.
The Nationality and Borders Bill, as it stands, does not comply with the 1951 Refugee Convention. Former Supreme Court Judge Lord Brown has said of the bill, several of these provisions flagrantly breach our obligations as interpreted by the UNHCR. Lord Brown has tabled an amendment to ensure compliance with the Convention. Can the Minister confirm whether the Government will support Lord Brown's amendment?
Thank you to the Honourable Lady for raising this point, and it is of course worthy to note that it is for Parliament to interpret our interpretation of international obligations in line with the Vienna Convention. We will always act in accordance with our international obligations. We've made that consistently clear. The bill has been for appropriate due diligence and we're going to get on and deliver it.
Number 11, please, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Tackling economic crime is a key government priority. We've expedited legislation to crack down on Russian dirty money and corrupt elites in the UK through the Economic Crime Transparency and Enforcement Act. We've also set up a new dedicated kleptocracy cell in the National Crime Agency to target sanctions evasion and corrupt assets hidden in the UK.
Thank you for that answer. GPT special projects were fined roughly £28 million in Southwark Crown Court last year for bribery offences. The key whistleblower in that case was my constituent, Ian Foxley. He has had 11 years without a single penny in income because he blew that whistle, because nobody will employ him now, of course. Does my right honourable friend agree that if we want to crack economic crime, we must incentivise whistleblowers to come forward and protect them when they do? And would you listen very carefully to my honourable friend, Member for Cheadle's 10-minute rule motion on this tomorrow, which sets out the case for whistleblower reform?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I mean, my friend is, of course, absolutely right about the value of whistleblowers. They should be able to come forward without fear of recrimination, and we've continued to improve the whistleblowing framework, including extending eligibility for protections and introducing a reporting requirement for prescribed persons, that's the bodies that people can make a whistleblowing disclosure to. I know my honourable friend has campaigned on this matter consistently and he's quite expert in it, and I would be keen to meet with him to further discuss his points.
Stone.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We continue to support those who were evacuated under Operation Pitting, the UK's largest evacuation operation in some decades, in particular with the search for permanent accommodation based on working with local councils to identify this.
Jeremy Stone.
Mr Speaker, Operation Pitting has evacuated some 15,000 Afghanis, and altogether the refugees and asylum seekers are costing the UK a surprising £4.7 million per day in terms of hotel accommodation. Of this, £1.2 million is spent on Afghan refugees. Hotels are clearly not the best in terms of education of children and schooling and all that sort of stuff. We would like to have these refugees in the north of Scotland and the Highlands, and they would like to come to the Highlands. Would the Minister agree to having a meeting with me to discuss how we can expedite this?
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm delighted to hear that there's housing available in the Highlands to support these people. We'd be very keen for them to be able to make their new home in the Highlands, a fantastic part of our United Kingdom. I'd be delighted to meet with the honourable member to discuss how we can get these families on the way to a permanent home and a welcoming community.
Speaker, Operation Pitting was a remarkable success in evacuating Afghans, but also is remarkable the number of Afghan women that have been left behind, seeking refuge and are now on the Taliban hit list. I have been trying to chase updates on a number of Afghan women, but have been unable to get any response from the Home Office. These women have been made very clear to them that the Taliban will kill them unless they can escape Afghanistan. Can the Minister meet with me to try and help me progress these women's cases?
Yes, very happy to meet with my honourable friend to discuss these women's cases. Of course, with the ACRS, we're working with groups like the UNHCR to identify particularly those women who would be affected by the Taliban rule. But yes, very happy to meet with her to discuss those cases.
Question 13, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our world-leading migration and economic development partnership with Rwanda will be a major boost to Rwanda and allow us to focus our efforts on people in need, not with those who have the ability to pay people smugglers to make dangerous, illegal journeys from safe countries like France.
The policy of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda is unworkable, unethical, and will either cost billions or else will result in so few people being sent to Rwanda that it will not act as a deterrent to all the evil people smugglers. So can the Secretary of State, can the Home Secretary tell me how much the policy will cost per person, or else what is the Home Secretary's maximum budget?
Mr. Speaker, I think we've discussed this in the House several times over the last week. The UK is providing an initial investment of £120 million of support for this partnership as part of the new Economic Transformation and Integration Fund. I hear what his party has said, and in fact I think the front bench were chuttering about this last week as well, that they are calling this policy extortionate and unworkable, but that of course is completely illogical, because if it's not workable then it's actually not going to cost the British taxpayer money, so it can't.
The Home Secretary deserves immense credit for her plan and her robust approach to deterring illegal immigration. The fact that we have not seen any small boat crossings in the last 3 days is evidence that some of the pull factors are now being removed. And does she agree with me that if this trend continues, the cost of this policy will take care of itself?
I'd like to thank Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend, for his question and his comments. I think first and foremost, I think the party opposite are still trying to work out that doing nothing is not an option at all, because people have died. And secondly, of course, this is exactly that. It is all about a deterrent, as well as making sure that we can provide the right, safe and humane approach for people that need our asylum system, while also cracking down on the people smuggling.
On to topical Scott Smith.
Topical one, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the Nationality and Borders Bill is the vehicle for the new plan for immigration. That is how we will address the challenge of illegal migration for the first time in over 2 decades through comprehensive reform of our asylum system. Illegal migration is facilitated by evil people smugglers, and of course the British public they despise these people smugglers, and they want their government to act to remove foreign criminals, but also deal with this whole issue of illegal migration. The Nationality and Borders Bill will mean that we can better protect and support those in need of asylum, deter illegal and dangerous routes of entry to the UK, and of course remove more easily those with no right to be here. The bill has already been strongly endorsed by the elected House, Mr. Speaker, and of course it's vital that the other place now works to ensure that this bill becomes law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I met with directors of the Business Improvement District in Lancaster, where we discussed the issue of antisocial behaviour in our city centre. Would the Home Secretary accept my invitation to come to Lancaster to meet with the directors of Lancaster BID and hear about the work that they're doing funding a BID warden to support police in Lancaster city centre to reduce antisocial behaviour?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and actually, if I may, I'd like to pay tribute to both her police force and also the Police and Crime Commissioner, Andrew Snowden. I was recently in Lancaster myself, about a month ago. I'd be delighted to visit again, I really would, and I do just want to emphasise the power of these business improvement districts when it comes to dealing with issues such as antisocial behaviour, but also giving businesses the confidence that they need, basically, to ensure that they've got the support from police, but also that they can carry on investing in their business and creating jobs locally.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the beginning of this Q&A session, my right honourable friend pointed out that as of last week, over 70,000 visas have been issued to Ukrainians. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that along with our £450 million package of military aid for Ukraine, the unprecedented package of sanctions against Russia and the world-leading aid provision, that this demonstrates our unwavering commitment to the Ukrainian people in their hour of need?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I think this is actually a point to reflect upon the United Kingdom's contribution to the Ukraine effort, as well as the aid, the military support that has been long-standing, actually, the government's commitment, the Prime Minister's leadership as well, and the fact that over 70,000 visas have been granted, and rightly so, to people that are fleeing war and persecution, and of course our schemes are completely uncapped.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker.
I've been contacted about a pensioner who found nothing was done about serious harassment by her neighbours, by shop owners who said nothing was done about someone who repeatedly smashed their windows, a burglary victim given nothing more than a crime number, and a rape victim who found herself being investigated rather than the rapist until the case was dropped. Victims who are all being badly let down. Under the Conservatives, even though more crimes are being reported to the police, arrests and prosecutions have gone sharply down. Why is the Home Secretary letting so many more criminals off?
Well, Mr. Speaker, on the contrary, and she will, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady may want to back our bill, basically, when it comes to police, crime, courts and sentencing, and she will also reflect upon the fact that when the statistics for crime in England and Wales for year ending September 2021 were published, neighbourhood crime was 33% lower than the previous year. Burglary offences were lower than the previous year. Other offences, including robbery, vehicle offences and theft from the person, were also down. This is also government, Mr. Speaker, that has invested record sums in policing, in training. Look at the work that we are doing with police and crime commissioners across the country. And there are a few other points, if I may, Mr. Speaker, make to the Honourable Lady, that when it comes to courts and...
Hold on, Secretary, I'm going to get through these topicals. I want to help you. You need to help me. Yvette Cooper.
I think the Home Secretary is out of touch with what's happening in communities across the country. Overall crime is up by 14%, and right across the country, fewer rapists, fewer thieves, fewer burglars are ever being sentenced at all because they aren't being arrested or taken to court in the first place. Since 2015, arrests by the police are down by a third. Charge rate is down by nearly 2/3. Cautions and community penalties have more than halved, and it doesn't matter what her rhetoric is, the reality is much more bleak. This is the equivalent of hundreds of thousands more criminals getting away with their crimes.
Look, I'm going to have to say to both parties, we really do want you to have good questions, but when you get more substantial questions like that, please do them earlier. Don't try and force them into topicals, because all you're doing is stopping me getting the backbenchers in who didn't get in early. So please, let's work to help each other. Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, in response to the Right Honourable Lady, when it comes to backing the police and sorting out the criminal justice system, if her party was at all serious, she'd back the bill and back the police and back reforms in the criminal justice system.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since Putin's evil invasion of Ukraine, Poland has given refuge to well over 2 million people. And when members of the British group of the Interparliamentary Union met recently with our Polish counterparts, they said one way we could help here was by setting up mayor-to-mayor twinning links. And in that light, will the Home Secretary welcome the twinning arrangement between Pershaw in West Worcestershire and Viry in Poland?
I commend and actually thank my right honourable friend for her question and actually the initiative that she has shown through this twinning arrangement. I think it's incredibly important, I really do. And Mr. Speaker, I think the House should pay tribute to our friends in Poland, the Polish government in particular, for everything that they have been doing when it comes to supporting Ukrainians.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2017, the UK government introduced a visa concession for offshore wind farm workers, which is extended for 1 year in July 2021. This visa concession effectively allows offshore wind farm companies to undercut the pay and conditions of British seafarers and exploit overseas workers. A few weeks ago, the Prime Minister committed to expanding offshore wind farms. So, in light of the disgraceful decision by P&O Ferries to sack 786 British seafarers and replace them with exploited foreign labour, will the Home Office commit to ending this offshore wind farm worker concession to ensure that UK seafarers are able to fairly compete for these jobs?
The gentleman makes very important points. I'm very happy to pick up with him directly on this, because we don't have time to give you a full answer. I'll happily speak to him about this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In recent months, we've seen an increase in totally unacceptable antisocial behaviour in Burnley and Padiham town centres, as well as dirt bikes racing up and down Padiham Greenway.
Could I ask the Home Secretary to meet with me in Padiham to talk to businesses and residents about what more we can do to tackle this issue?
Delighted, Mr. Speaker, to come to his constituency, do exactly that, and perhaps we could have a conversation about the Safer Street Funds, which will certainly assist on this issue.
Lachlan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm really getting so sick and tired of every time anybody on this side of the House talks about our disgust with the abandoned people in Rwanda scheme. That side starts shouting, what are your plans? Well, if they'd paid any attention in the 6 full weeks, of the Nationality and Borders Bill, read up on the multiple amendments that we put forward that this side voted down, and then you'll know what our plans are. But
the question is meant to be, not to her.
The question is, I submitted a written question because the main response to this is safe and legal routes, and they keep saying they have them. I submitted a written question asking for the detail of all of those available. And do you know what, Mr. Speaker? The detail fits on that size of a page because there's practically none for the entire world.
I may say to the Honourable Lady, first of all, she's read the new plan for immigration, and I hope she has. She'll be very clear about the government's policy around safe and legal routes. I have already, during questions today, Mr. Speaker, outlined a number of safe and legal routes that this government has committed to, including 2 routes for Ukrainian nationals and the 2 routes for those that fled Afghanistan last year.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People are exploited, beaten, robbed, raped and even die. And we need to do everything we can to stamp out this evil trade. Does my right honourable friend agree with me and the vast majority of residents of Rother Valley that this Rwanda plan is not only the right thing to do, as it will cut down on illegal immigration and reduce pressure on public services, but will ultimately save lives?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and while the benches opposite just yell out about their lack of support, I think actually I come back to a number of points, Mr. Speaker. Is first of all, doing nothing is not an option. We have to do everything we possibly can to break up these evil people smugglers who, are unhinged. They'll do nothing, basically, to exploit individuals. The final point, of course, Mr. Speaker, is it is through the new plan for immigration and our wider work through borders and nationality, which is coming back to the House tomorrow, that we want to bring this plan together and deliver for the British people.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On March the 30th, Lord Harrington had to apologise for inadvertently misleading the other place when he said that a drop-down arrow was available on the form for Ukrainian refugees in the Ukrainian language. But when he apologised, he said this was in train. Can she fess up and confirm that it's Home Office policy not to have a translated version of the form, or if it isn't, where's Lord Harrington's severely delayed train?
Mr. Speaker, if I may, for officials, Home Office officials that work on this scheme, there is guidance around dealing with different languages and the way in which applications are being dealt with. But I'm very happy to pick up with him directly on this.
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome the fact that dozens of visas have already been granted by this United Kingdom government for Ukrainians to come to the Scottish borders in my constituency. However, will the Home Secretary work with me to iron out the last remaining issues that some of my constituents have in terms of processing the applications to ensure that more Ukrainians can come to the Scottish borders?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is absolutely right on this. There is work underway, actually, to ensure that we can bring more Ukrainian nationals through our 2 routes to come to Scotland. I'm very happy to meet with him and with the Minister to discuss this further.
Speaker, my constituent, Graham Hughes, is today doing his latest run to a humanitarian run to Poland and hopes to return with a Ukrainian refugee and her 11-year-old daughter, who recently managed to escape the horrors of Mariupol shortly before the evacuation routes closed, but they're now waiting anxiously in Lviv. Despite Graham and his partner applying to sponsor them nearly a month ago, they're yet to be granted passage to the UK. Graham and Catherine are ready to bring these people to safety in Durham. Will the Home Secretary do everything possible to expedite this?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'd like to, through the Honourable Lady, pass on our thanks to her constituent, obviously, who's now travelling to Poland. I will need the details, if I may take the details from her, to ensure that both the visa side and the sponsorship side do actually match up, and then obviously we can pick that up.
All my right. Nottinghamshire Police on hitting their recruitment uplift target a year ahead of schedule, so that we now have more police officers in Nottinghamshire than at any time in the last 10 years. And can she commit to a date when the long-promised police funding formula review will start?
Yay. First of all, if I may, I would just like to commend Nottinghamshire Police and your outstanding Chief Constable, if I may say so, as well, for all the work that the team have been doing, and actually really focusing on driving down crime through recruitment and the training of new officers. She rightly asked about police funding formula, which clearly is something that is underway through the Policing Minister. It is deeply complicated, and she'll be well aware of that, but we're happy to report back on this.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One mother from Barnsley submitted her daughter's passport application in January, 5 months in advance of their holiday next week, but is yet to receive it. My office have had to wait 2 hours to speak to someone at the Home Office today. What is the Minister doing to address the unacceptable delays in passport applications?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady heard the comments from the Minister earlier on about the Passport Office and work there. But it is unusual, if I may. She said her constituent submitted the case of the passport in January. If we can have the details, we'll pick that up. But that is a very, very unusual delay. There must be a problem.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now then, the world-class Rwanda plan has been welcomed by anybody who actually lives in the real world, because it saves lives in the Channel. Unfortunately, that lot opposite there don't live in the real world. But does the Home Secretary agree with me that the Labour Party have got a chance now to either back this plan or back the criminals?
The Honourable Friend, as ever, is very, very clear it's world-class and a world first, and something we are proud of. And actually, Mr. Speaker, it's in a partnership. It is a partnership that our partners in Rwanda are proud of as well. They have an exceptional history of resettlement of refugees. And he, of course, is absolutely right. The British people want change. They absolutely do. We say to everyone today, back the plan, but also back the National Anti-Borders Bill.
Judith Cummins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm extremely concerned about the safeguarding of our young people at outdoor music festivals, because these festivals attract over 7.1 million people, many of them who are under 18, and currently there's more provision made in licensing over the recycling of a plastic cup than for our young people who have suffered serious sexual assault, including rape, by spiking. So will the Minister work with me and others to create a gold standard of licensing for these events to protect our young people?
I'm very happy to work with the Honourable Lady. We've already spoken about this issue, actually, and I'm grateful for her interest in it. Of course, as the country gets back to festivals this summer, we all want young women and girls especially, and all young people, to enjoy themselves safely. So I will work with her across government to take forward the asks that she's presented to us.
Rob Butler.
Speaker, I've been very alarmed to hear of large-scale and dangerous hair coursing in my constituency, where heavily armed people are coming onto farmers' land and then live-streaming these chases to China, where there is heavy betting being put on the chases. So will my right honourable friend support Thames Valley Police in their efforts to tackle this appalling offence and reassure farmers in Buckinghamshire that rural crime will always be taken seriously by this government?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. He knows the strength of feeling around this issue amongst the front bench and colleagues on our side of the House, which is why we have the Police Crime Courts and Sentencing Bill that we are urging everyone to back. And I would like to commend Thames Valley Police in particular for everything that they're doing on this.
We now come to the first of the two statements. I call the Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now been 61 days since Russia invaded Ukraine, and it has been 74 days since my Russia counterpart assured me that the Russian army would not be invading. As the invasion approaches its 9th week, I want to update the House on the current situation and what steps we are taking to further our support to the Ukrainian people. It is our assessment that approximately 15,000 Russian personnel have been killed during their offensive, alongside the death toll or the equipment losses, and in total, a number of sources suggest that to date, over 2,000 armoured vehicles have been destroyed or captured. This includes at least 530 tanks, 530 armoured personnel carriers, and 560 infantry fighting vehicles. Russia has also lost over 60 helicopters and fighter jets. The offensive that was supposed to take a maximum of a week has now taken weeks. Last week, Russia admitted that the Slava-class cruiser Moskva has sunk, the second key naval asset that they have lost since invading, significantly weakening their ability to bring their maritime assets to bear from the Black Sea. As I said, Mr. Speaker, in my last statement, Russia has so far failed in nearly every one of its objectives. In recognition of this failure, the Russian High Command has regrouped, reinforced and changed focus to securing Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. A failure of the Russian Ministry of Defence commander control at all levels has meant they have now appointed one overall commander, General Dvornikov. At the start of this conflict, Russia had committed over 120 battalion tactical groups, approximately 65% of its entire ground combat strength. As of now, we assess that around over 25% of these have been rendered not combat effective. Ukraine, Mr. Speaker, is an inspiration to us all. Their brave people have never stopped fighting for their lands. They have endured indiscriminate bombardment, war crimes and overwhelming military aggression. But they have stood firm, galvanised the international community and beaten back the army of Russia in the north and the northeast. We anticipate that this next phase of the invasion will be an attempt by Russia to occupy further the Donbass and connect via Mariupol the Crimea, and so it is urgent that we in the international community ensure Ukraine gets the aid and weapons it so much needs. As Defence Secretary, I have ensured that of each step of the way, the UK's support is tailored to the anticipated actions of Russia. To date, we have provided more than 5,000 anti-tank missiles, 5 air defence systems with more than 100 missiles, 1,360 anti-structural munitions, 4.5 tonnes of plastic explosives. And in response to indiscriminate bombing from the air and escalation by President Putin's forces on the 9th of March, I announced the UK would supply Starstreak high-velocity and low-velocity anti-air missiles. I'm able to now report to the House that these have been in theatre for over 3 weeks and have been deployed and used by Ukrainian forces to defend themselves and their territory. Over recess, my ministerial team, Mr. Speaker, hosted a Ukrainian government delegation at Salisbury Plain training area to explore further equipment options. This was quickly followed by the Prime Minister announcing a further £100 million worth of high-grade military equipment, 120 armoured vehicles, sourcing anti-ship missiles and high-tech loitering munitions for precision strikes. But as we can see from Ukrainians' requests, more still needs to be done. So for that reason, I can now announce to the House that we shall be gifting a small number of armoured vehicles fitted with launchers for those anti-air missiles. These Stormer vehicles will give Ukraine forces enhanced short-range anti-air capabilities both day and night. Since my last statement, more countries have answered the call and more have stepped up to support. The Czech Republic has supplied T-72 tanks and BMP fighting vehicles, and Poland has also pledged T-72 tanks. Mr. Speaker, the quickest route to help Ukraine is with similar equipment and ammunition to what they already use. The UK government obviously does not hold Russian equipment, but in order to help where we do not have such stock, we have enabled and others to donate. Alongside Canada and Poland, the Royal Air Force has been busy moving equipment from donor countries to Ukraine. And at the same time, if no donor can be found, we are making purchasing equipment from the open market. On the 31st of March, I held my second international donor conference, involving an increase of countries to 35 countries, including representatives from the EU and NATO. So far, these efforts have yielded some 2.5 million items of equipment worth over £1.5 billion. These next 3 weeks are key. Ukraine needs more long-range artillery and ammunition, and both Russian and NATO calibre types to accompany them. They also seek anti-ship missiles to counter Russian ships that are able to bombard Ukrainian cities. Mr. Speaker, it is therefore important to say that, if possible, the UK will seek to enable to supply each weapons. I shall keep the House up to date, and also members of each front bench across the House, as we proceed. The MOD is working day and night to support, alongside the US, Canada and the EU, continued logistical supplies. But not all the aid is lethal. We have also sent significant quantities of non-lethal equipment to Ukraine. To date, we've sent over 90,000 ration packs, over 10 pallets of medical equipment, more than 3,000 pieces of body armour, nearly 77,000 helmets and 3,000 pairs of boots, and much more, including communications equipment and air defence. On top of our military aid to Ukraine, we contribute to strengthening NATO's collective security for both the immediate challenge and the long term. We have temporarily doubled the number of defensive personnel in Estonia, sent military personnel to support Lithuania intelligence, resilience and reconnaissance efforts, deployed hundreds of Royal Marines to Poland, and sent offshore patrol vessels and Navy destroyers to the eastern Mediterranean. We've also increased our presence in the skies over south-eastern Europe with 4 additional Typhoons based in Romania. That means we now have a full squadron of RAF fighter jets in southern Europe ready to support NATO tasking. As the Prime Minister announced on Friday, we are also offering a deployment of British Challenger 2 tanks to Poland to bridge the gap between Poland donating tanks to Ukraine and their replacement arriving from a third country. Looking further ahead, NATO is reassessing its posture, and the UK is leading conversations at NATO about how best the alliance can deter and defend against threats. My NATO colleagues and I tasked the alliance to report to leaders at the summit in June with proposals for concrete, long-term and sustainable changes. Mr. Speaker, some of us in this House knew that behind the mask, the Kremlin was not the international statement it pretended to be. With this invasion of Ukraine, all of Europe can now see the true face of President Putin and his inner circle. His intention is only to destroy, to crush, to rub out the free peoples of Ukraine. He does not want to preserve. He must not be allowed to prevail. Ukrainians are fighting for their very lives, and they are fighting for our freedoms. The President of Ukraine himself said it as much. If Russia stops fighting, there will be peace. If Ukraine stops fighting, there will be no more Ukraine. Thank you.
I now come to the Shadow Secretary of State, John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and say his presence is welcomed this afternoon by the whole House, Mr. Speaker. We know it's not entirely his fault, but it's nearly 7 weeks since he was last able to give us a statement on the situation in Ukraine. That was the day after President Zelensky addressed this House. He said then, as he said this afternoon, that he will keep the House up to date. And can I just say, on behalf of the public, we would welcome more regular statements as the Russian war on Ukraine continues. Like the Secretary of State, Mr. Speaker, we salute the bravery of the Ukrainian people, the military and civilians alike. It is led by President Zelensky personally, but it's typified by the military last stand of those troops in the Azovstal steel plant and by the people's resistance in Russian-occupied Kherson. We also renew our total condemnation of this brutal Russian invasion of a sovereign country and our determination to see all those responsible for the mass graves in Mariupol, the crimes and rapes and assassinations in Bucha, and the civilian bombings in almost every town and city across Ukraine. We are determined to see them pursued to the end for their war crimes. Mr. Speaker, we welcome the role the UK is playing. We welcome the further UK military assistance to Ukraine that the Secretary of State has outlined today. This has our full Labour support. The Defence Secretary says the UK has provided 5,000 anti-tank missiles, 100 anti-air missiles. These direct donations are a fraction of the total, so can he tell us what the current total of such weapons provided so far by Western allies is? And can he tell us whether the MOD has yet signed contracts and started production of replacement NLAWs and Starstreak missiles? This is the first day of the third month of Putin's invasion. This is a new phase, as the Defence Secretary has said. What is needed now is no longer old spare weapons from the Soviet era, but new NATO weapons that Ukraine will need for Putin's next offensive against Odessa or Kiev. We need to shift from crisis management in response to the current conflict to delivering medium-term military support that Ukraine will need in future. So what is the Secretary of State doing to ensure this step change in support takes place? And given that 5 million refugees have now left Ukraine, what is the Secretary of State doing to offer the 700 personnel still held at high readiness in the UK for humanitarian help? And is it still the case that the MOD has only offered 140 Armed Forces personnel to help sort out the shameful shambles of the Home Office visa and refugee system? Mr. Speaker, I've just got off the tube from visiting NATO's Allied Maritime Command in Northwood. They took my phone off me, so I hadn't realised we were having a statement, which is why I'm using handwritten notes this afternoon. But this is a proud, professional, British-led, multinational command. And I pay tribute to the work that they are doing day in, day out to keep us all safe. NATO has proved such a powerful security alliance because it pools such multinational military capacity, capability and cash, with an annual budget over $1 trillion to protect 1 billion people. But Ukraine, Mr. Speaker, reminds us that the greatest threat to UK security lies in Europe, in the North Atlantic and the Arctic, not the Indo-Pacific. This reinforces NATO as our primary UK security obligation. But I say to the Secretary of State, he's given us a paragraph in his statement today on NATO. Our leadership in NATO could be at risk as Britain falls behind allies in responding to this Ukraine invasion. More than a dozen European countries are now rebooting security plans and defence spending, but the UK has not yet done either. Can I urge him, therefore, to revisit the integrated review, review defence spending, reform military procurement and rethink his army cuts? Because, Mr. Speaker, we will be dealing with the consequences of Putin's war for many years to come. And now is the time for longer-term thinking about how the strategy for European security must change.
Secretary of State. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Member Officer. And I apologise, we had spoken last week, I think, about timing of this, and I had hoped to do the statement tomorrow, but the United States has called a 40-nation meeting in Germany tomorrow, and I will therefore not be here. So I took the opportunity when I can, so I'm sorry if he has cut short his trip. I'll be delighted to arrange with the Navy for him to return to the headquarters without his phones, maybe for longer, in custody. Mr. Speaker, as I said, I promised to keep the House updated, and I have not only briefed a number of our colleagues from this House from across parties on a number of occasions, I've also given members access to our intelligence officials and indeed senior generals to get the latest throughout. And my honourable friend, the Minister of the Armed Forces, has had 2 debates and I think answered 1 UQ. I won't take the credit for the UQ. I think governments get UQ, but nevertheless it is an opportunity. We will continue to update all members, and I'm very happy to have another cross-house sort of dial-in for all members on that subject, and I think it is incredibly important that we do so. Just like calibrating our response to Russia, it's important that the government calibrates its response within the House, that we make sure that everything is not a surprise to members, and indeed that we consult as we go along. The Right Honourable Member asked questions about NLAWs and Starstreak. We have an ongoing relationship with the industry. We will be replacing them, or are replacing them. Not surprisingly, there's now a lot of interest in those British-made products, but nevertheless it is very important that we replenish our stocks, and we are obviously in that line to do so. The Treasury has agreed to fund the new for old of replacements of those, but it is very important, given the state of the Russian government, that we make sure we replenish as soon as we can. It is a daily relationship with our industry. The Ministry of Defence Procurement speaks to them at least once a week. The Prime Minister will soon convene a meeting with all the leads to make sure that we are doing everything we can, not just for ourselves, but also for Ukraine and others, to make sure. And sometimes there is a bit, Mr. Speaker, a bit of juggling where I release something we don't yet need to go to another country so they can have it first, or whether threat is more pressing, or indeed persuade a friendly country to divert their order to be able to come to us or to Ukraine. And we are often involved in that basic defence diplomacy, where we know a country is buying something like an NLAW, they don't need it right now, could we take it off their hands, and then they delay it. So we try and make sure we do that as much as possible. I'm delighted to place in the House, Mr. Speaker, the international update of how much has been donated. Obviously, some countries are more open than others about what they have done, and so what I will place in the library is a table showing those based on, it's not for me to let another country's identity be known if they wish to keep it secret, but what we can publish, we shall. What I can inform the House is that in the last week alone, for example, we've supplied 1,000 anti-tank weapons, 14 Wolfhound armoured vehicles, 4,000 night vision goggles has gone in the week alone, and that is, I can update further that we have supplied also to date 5,361 NLAWs from the original 2,000, over 200 javelins, 104 high-velocity and low-velocity missile for anti-air, which will grow to over 250. And obviously, if there are any more new weapon types, I will inform the House as we do that. On the statement of NATO, one of the discussions we will have in the sidelines tomorrow is obviously about what future for NATO. NATO defence ministers a few weeks ago in Brussels, we tasked NATO to go away and come back with its long-term plans. I think the Right Honourable Member is very right. We're in crisis management, we're in short-term response, but we need a long-term plan. We need to know what will NATO look like, and how will Western Europe, or Europe including many of its new members, contain Putin after all this has passed, because we have a man who has clearly been involved in an illegal invasion of a country, war crimes against the Ukrainian people, and how are we going to live with that neighbour in Europe should he still remain, and that is an important consideration for all of us. And it does go to its heart of defence reform and our spending. Of course, as I've always said, as the threat changes, so must our defence posture, and indeed that includes funding. As I've said publicly, the here and now, Mr. Speaker, we are getting the spending we need, but he is right to raise the issue of medium and long-term funding, which we will definitely be looking at. In addition to his point about we are now the only country, that is because we were the first country, Mr. Speaker, when we had our £24 billion settlement. No one else had gone there yet in NATO. Sweden had gone, but they weren't in. Australia had gone. So the Right Honourable Member's comments are slightly punishing Britain for being the first, because it was way before the invasion of Ukraine. A lot of these increases have been afterwards. That isn't to say that we shouldn't look at what more we can all do and how that knocks into other areas. Thank you.
That's good. We now come to the Chair of the Select Committee, Tobias Elwood.
Mr. Speaker, you heard it there first. There's a request for more urgent questions, which I'm happy to oblige. Could I very much welcome this statement here today that focuses on the operational. A reality is now dawning, however, that this conflict could last months, indeed years, but also more widely that Europe has actually entered a new and dangerous era of insecurity. So I pose two fundamental questions to the Secretary of State. Firstly, what does success in Ukraine look like? Are we doing enough to prevent Ukraine from losing, but not enough to make sure that they win? What is our strategy? Is it to push Russia back from the pre-February lines, or indeed liberate the entire Donbass region? If it's in Europe's wider security interest to see Putin humiliated in Ukraine, then the entire mainland must be liberated. That must be our strategic aim. And the second fundamental issue, and he touched on it, is our defence posture. Threats are increasing, but pressures on our armed forces are growing, as indeed is our equipment as well. Is it not now time to increase defence spending to 3%?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend is a doughty campaigner for 3% of spending, and I consider him my long-range artillery when it comes to potentially the lobbying in the long term, whatever we see as a result of Ukraine. Look, our strategic aim is twofold. One is that Putin must fail in Ukraine, he must fail in his invasion, and I think he is on course to do that, actually. He must fail in his occupation of Ukraine, and I think he has definitely failed in achieving that. To the fine-tuning of that is as much a matter of Ukraine's choice as it is of anybody else. That Ukraine gets to choose where it wishes to settle for peace. We will do everything we can to support them. For my part, Mr. Speaker, I want Putin not only beyond the pre-February boundaries. He invaded Crimea illegally, he invaded Donetsk illegally, and he should comply with international law and, in the long run, leave Ukraine. And overall, the cost and the consequence of what he has done, he needs to wear it on his shoulders.
We now come to SNP spokesperson Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. We, on these benches, welcome the sight of the additional measures taken to support Ukraine on behalf of the United Kingdom, and we also welcome the engagement that I know the Secretary of State has had with the SNP leadership in this place. Mr. Speaker, his statement highlights the bravery of Ukraine's defence forces, but I'm sure he also acknowledges that alongside this bravery is an exceptional tactical efficacy in stark contrast to the Russian invaders, and I'm sure he'd have no hesitation in agreeing with that observation. The Secretary of State highlights in his statement Russia's apparent reduced ambition to consolidate in the east of Ukraine around Donbass, and through Mariupol tried to secure a land bridge to Crimea. Can he reassure the House today that enduring economic pressure and further military support will continue to frustrate this Russian ambition of aggression? It was a great pleasure for me to meet the Royal Marine Commandos from 4-5 Commando in Arbroath in Warsaw earlier this month. But what more can be done by NATO allies to ensure that our partners on the eastern flank of NATO are further reassured around NATO's determination to stand firm against any and all aggression towards our allies? And finally, I welcome the details of the £100 million for higher grade equipment, including anti-ship missiles. As the Secretary of State will be all too well aware, you don't get an awful lot of higher grade equipment for £100 million. So I'd welcome any further advice he can give us on that. And in terms specifically of anti-ship role, can he confirm that brimstone missiles have no role in that application? And can he discuss with us, if possible, what role the UK's Harpoon missiles will have in that application? And if we're not donating UK stocks of Harpoon missiles, is that because we don't have enough ourselves? Thank you.
Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just on the Harpoon, we're not at present providing Harpoon. Our Harpoon missiles are launched from ships, whereas very few nations, I don't think any nowadays, launch from land Harpoon. It was there's a lot of media around this invasion, Mr. Speaker, and there isn't a day go past where I have to counter just stories that have appeared somehow made up. Some of them, I think. The AS-90 going to Ukraine was another story that appeared in the Daily Express this weekend. No, they're not. So I don't know where that came from, but it is not. So on that, on brimstone missiles, we made a commitment, I think nearly 18 months ago, 2 years ago, when we were selling fast attack patrol boats to Ukraine, that we would sell it armed with maritime brimstone missiles. We would do that. They are not at present in the country. Those ships have not been yet purchased or delivered. However, if we wish to provide brimstones in whatever guises they are, I will inform members of this House when we do it. I don't close it off as an opportunity. I think it is a perfectly legitimate thing. There are different sophistications between Block 1, which is just land brimstone, to developments that we've never bought that they can do at sea. So they are range in their capabilities. And I think first and foremost, we will look to provide, if we do, brimstone for the land, using stock we already hold, but not as yet on the sea. What more can we do for our eastern colleagues? I would always advise colleagues, and many of you here already know about the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a tremendous group of the 10 Nordic countries I recently asked my colleagues from around the House to the dinner when we had the Jeff Summit here in the UK. They are Scandinavian and the Baltic states, the United Kingdom, Iceland. They are a tremendous grouping of people. Some people describe them as the beer-drinking nations. I'm less charitable and describe it's the nations with probably the worst weather in Europe, so that's what uniquely binds us together. But we are the doers in Europe. We get on and do it, we share, we exercise, we train together, and it also involves Finland and Sweden, and I think that's a very, very good group. And as to 4-5 Commander in Arbroath, they have done an excellent job, are doing an excellent job, and they are, as he says, in Poland, and they are incredibly professional, and there is more work for them to do.
So Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clear that the supply and use of missiles has turned military assets such as ships, aircraft and tanks into costly losses and liabilities. The one gap appears to be artillery. I know the Secretary of State said that we're supplying some artillery, but as the earlier episodes show, the counter to a weapon system is not necessarily the same weapon system, but a missile to destroy it. What can be done to prevent the one area that Russia still seems to be succeeding in, which is the use of artillery to raise cities to the ground without engaging Ukrainian forces properly?
First Dave.
I think my right honourable friend has put his finger right on the heart of the current race, and the race is on to equip Ukraine with the same long-range capabilities that Russia has, so that they are not outranged and indeed pinned down. That's why we first and foremost started with sourcing around the world 152mm, so Soviet calibre, so they can keep going with that. And in parallel, a number of nations we are exploring with providing either 105, which is our main sort of lightweight guns, and the 155 in more mobile versions than the big armoured AS-90s, because one of the things that this modern battlefield is showing is you better move quickly once you've fired your guns, because you can be found very quickly by pretty cheap off-the-shelf UAVs. And so, exactly as he said, in parallel there's a race on. We've now seen a number of eastern countries providing 155 howitzers. That unlocks NATO ammunition. We'll play our part and make sure it gets to them. In addition, you've got to improve the intelligence that goes around artillery, so we are exploring counter-battery radar, so that as soon as Russia fires a shell at you, you know exactly where it comes from and you can return the favour.
Speaker, the Secretary of State may have heard that I've been calling for more regular performance. I'm a great admirer of his, but I've just been starved of his company. I'm very pleased to have this statement today, but is he aware that many of us are encouraged by the information we've given today, but people in Mariupol have been dying of starvation and no water. We have a navy. Hasn't it been possible to supply food, water, that sort of stuff by sea? It may be that I'm not a logistics or military expert, but it seems strange those people have been starving and we haven't sent food.
Thursday. I understand his deep sense of frustration, not from listening to me, but obviously from regards to the people of Mariupol. Look, the nations of the Black Sea govern the Black Sea through something called the Montreux Declaration, which is a very old piece of law, and at times of war they can shut the Black Sea to any nation other than Black Sea nations. Turkey did that at the very beginning. That actually disadvantages Russia greater than anything else. And therefore we couldn't go in even if we wish. I'd already spoken to the Turks and the Romanians about minesweeping capability, because what is clear is that this summer a lot of the grain won't go out through Ukraine, but it might go out through neighbouring countries as Romania, and that's really important. But at the moment it is not possible for us to put ships into the Black Sea, and Russia will not be able to replace its ships, but it does give them at the moment another sense of strength of trying to control the area, which is why the Ukrainians need anti-ship missiles to make sure that they get at least some access to their coastline.
Blake Drummond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As Russia flounders on the battlefields of Ukraine due to the bravery of the Ukrainians, President Putin has raised the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons. Can my right honourable friend ensure that the government and our allies does everything it can to deter the President Putin from taking this disastrous step?
We've all seen with concern the playing in of the nuclear weapons by Putin, either in the earlier statements or indeed recent test fires. Look, I think the first thing is to remind colleagues that NATO is a nuclear alliance. Britain, America and France obviously are in possession of nuclear weapons, and that is first and foremost a strong deterrent to him. He can invest in lots of different other missiles, but fundamentally some are out there right now under the sea, are brave men and women of the Royal Navy, silent and able to deliver an effect of nuclear, if they had to, in defence of this kingdom and indeed in effect in defence of NATO. And it's incredibly important that he doesn't forget that.
Cavan Jones.
Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement? Can I commend his leadership and his team's leadership throughout this crisis? He's already outlined quite an impressive list of equipment that ourselves, our NATO allies and EU allies have provided for Ukraine. Some of that we provide is legacy equipment, other is from inventory. So could he assure me that the cost of that is coming from the Treasury's Central Reserve and not the defence budget?
My right honourable colleague asked a very important question. Yes, to date we have gifted in aid £200 million, which we propose will grow to £500 million to Ukraine. The Treasury have agreed to old for new in funding that replacement.
Bob Seeley.
Mr. Speaker, I wrote to the Secretary of State last week about a few issues, and I'm hoping he'll have a chance to look at the letter today that comes with a present from some Ukrainian soldiers. Can I return to the issue of 155 spec? Because this is a potential game changer. Is he saying that we're leaving it up to other countries on this because we don't have the field guns ourselves, or will he be looking at supplying AS-90, or as you ruled AS-90 out altogether? Secondly, there are some very specific naval supplies mentioned in the letter, but more generally, from Odessa to Zaporozhye, there is a lack of body armour still and medical kits. And what reassurance can he give me on them? Thank you.
So on body armour, we'll be flowing more body armour next week to Ukraine. The United States is sending 200,000 155 shells, and I think 2 battalions worth of 155 tubes. I'm not a gunner, but apparently that's the terms to do that. At the same time, we will scour whatever we can. They're also interested in the 105R guns as well, and we will look to provide that as well. Look, the AS-90 is a very old 155 armoured vehicle, as he knows. They're over 40 tonnes. One of the challenges with that is to get it from one side of Ukraine to the other, low loaders, big logistics, and I think if we can help source 155s that are more mobile and more modern, then I think that's the better way to proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to put on record my thanks to the right honourable gentleman towards me as an opposition spokesman for defence, his cooperative attitude. At a recent meeting of the Servants of the People Party, which is incidentally a sister party of my own party, an impassioned plea was made. And the plea was this. As the Russians have retreated from parts of the Ukraine, they have left a ghastly and deadly legacy in the shape of landmines. Now, the Ukrainians are doing their very best to get rid of this hideous, hideous calling card. But already a number of Ukrainians have been killed in their efforts to get rid of the landmines. My plea is this, Mr. Speaker. We, the UK, possess the equipment and indeed the skills to help rid the Ukraine of landmines. Could I ask the Secretary of State if he would look kindly on this request from the Ukraine?
Yeah. The honourable gentleman's right, honourable gentleman's right. Yes, of course, we'll look at that issue. It hasn't appeared yet in the shopping list from the Ukrainians to me, but he is absolutely right. I visited Mariupol and other countries a few years ago and saw the minefields left behind after 2014, where the Russians destroyed everything and then left minefields across acres of farmland, just, I don't know what for, but to obviously impoverish the people there and leave their mark.
Daniel Kaczynski.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome my right honourable friend's announcement that there will be a deployment of British Challenger 2 tanks to Poland to allow our Polish allies to send the Soviet-era tanks to Ukraine. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been an agreement within NATO to facilitate Polish MiG fighter jets to be sent to Ukraine. As this war continues, We are very much aware of the need for the Ukrainians to have additional air capability to take on the Russians. Will he use his good auspices in the coming NATO meetings to press our American allies on this issue?
Tuesday.
My honourable friend makes a good point. I think the one thing to point out is it's about really bilateral enabling rather than NATO as itself, as an organisation. But he is right. In fact, what the Ukrainians are after are ground attack aircraft more than they are air-to-air. So rather than the MiG-29s, the Su-30s, things like that, those sort of aeroplanes. I will certainly be raising it tomorrow with my US counterpart when I see him. I think it's important, but at the moment what we're focused on is the deep, long-range artillery.
Clive Apple.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Taking nothing away from the incredible performance of the Ukrainian army in defending its country, but all of us can't help but be struck by how completely useless the Russian forces seem to be, and how inefficient they seem to be in organising themselves in this campaign. And having said that, there are increasing reports of mercenaries being used by Russians. I wonder if he could say to what degree they are involved in this conflict, and whether there is any way to prevent them getting into positions where they can participate.
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right to point out the woeful performance. It's very hard when you know, I don't celebrate the loss of anyone's life, and when I see the huge casualty rates of Russian soldiers, as a former soldier, I think it is a disgrace, a betrayal of those young men. It's hard to have sympathy when it isn't just the generals clearly engaged in war crime and butcheries that we've seen, but some in Russia are mothers and wives left because of arrogance of generals. Poor performance and corruption has led many of those young men to their deaths. On his other point about, I've forgotten now, so I've slipped my mind. Mercenaries, yes, we see evidence of Wagner Group now being actively deployed in Ukraine. We've seen some Free Syrian fighters. We've seen media around Chechnya volunteers. Wagner Group is a pain and a pest, globally used deniably, apparently, but not really that deniable, as an arm of the Kremlin. We've seen it in Africa, we see it in Mali now, we've seen it in Libya, we've seen it elsewhere. I think the international community needs to come together to deal with something like Wagner, because whatever happens to them in Ukraine, and what we are seeing is they're not getting very good kit and they are being some of the first to die, so not a great recruiting advert for them, but what they are going to be a problem that we have to deal with.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to commend the Secretary of State for the actions he has taken to help Ukraine. In history, I think this is going to be seen as a genocide, not just war crimes, but genocide. Would the Secretary of State work with me to persuade the Foreign Office that it is the same as the Holodomor, although obviously different, in the 1930s, but it is going to be a genocide, as was the Holodomor?
I think what's really important on both use or the accusation of genocide and indeed war crimes is that, in a sense, it doesn't need a politician to make that allegation. We are lucky in this part of the world that we have the ICC, we have our courts in The Hague, we have independent investigators who right now are collecting evidence and will be able to point a finger without any favour or political agenda. I think that's a really important difference between us and them. I think the Russians would love politicians in the West to be standing up pointing fingers, because the Russians could say, you would say that, wouldn't you? What I want to see is our respected judiciary and our law enforcement agencies gathering the evidence and then putting it to the people who politically we all think are clearly responsible for much of the problems in Ukraine.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Secretary of State for not only the statement today, but for his diligence and commitment over the last number of months. He may recall on a previous statement I did suggest that being so publicly explicit, NATO being so publicly explicit that there would be no troops on the ground was a vulnerability for Ukraine. And as we see, the Russians are becoming more desperate and diabolical in the tactics that they use, from rape to war crimes, genocide, the threat of chemical attack and potential technical and tactical nuclear attack. How sustainable does he believe it will be for the international community to give support, yes, but stay far removed?
Well, I think when NATO says NATO deployment, what they are saying is that as a NATO deployment, it's perfectly possible around the world for Britain and France and others to deploy unilaterally. You know, when we deployed into Poland recently, we're not doing it as a NATO country, we're doing it as Britain's support to one of our oldest allies. I think what happens in Ukraine over time, I mean, when this phase finishes, and let's hope it does soon, you know, we had orbital there. We had British trainers on the ground right up until pretty much the last. We sent the Rangers Battalion Regiment to train people on NLAWs just before the invasion. So we will inevitably wish to go back to help Ukraine in its long-term planning. It's very important we help them move out of crisis to a long-term plan, long-term ability to defend themselves, and Britain will always offer that opportunity with our training of troops. When we start doing that, that is open for debate, but you know, I don't rule anything out.
Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I commend my right honourable friend for his leadership in this matter and for the work of he and his colleagues in ensuring that our friends, the Ukrainians, are able to defend themselves. Can I just say to him, when I was recently in Lithuania, they made it clear to me that the Baltic states are deeply, deeply worried about some of the behaviour of one or two members of NATO. They commended the UK for their leadership against any kind of attempted settlement and on the slow behaviour of the Germans at the time until the UK pushed them to do more with the banking system of SWIFT, etc. But one of the things they were questioning me about was that does NATO look strategically? My honourable friend just said just a few minutes ago that each individual country looks at these arms trades and transfers separately. But does NATO now look that once Ukraine has succeeded in defending itself from defeat, it must move on to the next bit of the posture, which is to be able to move on to the offensive? And does therefore NATO look at all of these arms, including aircraft, as raised by my honourable friend, as a role for them to be able to take the fight back to the Russians?
So, right honourable friend, probably like me, served in northern Germany when permanent presence was used as one of the most important deterrents to the then Soviet Union, that we weren't just there for a short term, we were there for a very long period of time. And I think when we are seeking to find out and ask, actually not find out, NATO to come up with a long-term plan, it has to involve things like long-term containment of Russia. The best, defence is offence, he is correct, and I think certainly showing that you are well-equipped, capable, ready, deployable and deployed is one of the best ways of pushing and making President Putin cease what he is doing. I don't think that means NATO deploying outside of its borders, but I do mean it makes sure that we are very quick to respond and we are absolutely overmatching Russia in everything that it wishes to explore so that Putin doesn't dare do it.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. As this war has intensified, the distinction between providing defensive as opposed to offensive weapons has now largely disappeared as increasingly heavy equipment is being transferred. The Secretary of State had said previously to the House that he would support the provision of suitable aircraft to the Ukrainian Air Force. Further to the question asked by the Honourable Member for Shrewsbury and Atcham, what is his current assessment of the appetite of countries that have suitable aircraft that could be used in this new phase of the conflict to provide it to Ukraine?
Well, I think there are some who have appetite. There aren't many. Some of this equipment is quite old. A lot of the MiG-29s in the east come from the fall of the Berlin Wall, so you can sort of gauge the age of those. But there are some useful aircraft, the ground attack aircraft in Europe, and as I say, I would defend any one of those nations' options of deploying them, and one of the ways we could help support them is by backfilling, by supplying our own Typhoons to patrol their skies, etc., where to do it. So I think the hunt is still on. I'm very happy to, if anyone comes forward, to support them. Sometimes they've been updated with third countries' equipment, which gives those countries a veto, and I will also work to persuade those third countries to release any holds on them as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Russia has clearly suffered serious logistical issues in this first phase of the conflict. Can I ask my right honourable friend what other lessons we have learnt from the first phase of the conduct, and to what extent we can use those lessons as we enter into what seems to be a new phase?
Well, I think the first lesson, which don't take Russia at its word, take it on its action, is absolutely, I think, the most important lesson for many in the international community, which we, I suppose, gave up on a long time ago. But nevertheless, I think that's the first thing. I think there's going to be a lot of lessons. I think I wouldn't rush into it, because we need to also learn from the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are quite rightly focused on fighting, rather than a sort of a feedback loop to us, which will be essential in understanding it. I think the big lesson here is we have to prove to the world that ripping up international law, being more brutal than your adversary, still doesn't get you to win. Because there's one calculation I think President Putin and his generals have is, we don't care about human life, we don't care about international law, and if we just maintain that, somehow we'll achieve victory, irrespective of the cost and there's human suffering. International community has to be totally unified in demonstrating that as folly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his update on the deployment of UK personnel along NATO's eastern flank. But can he detail what role they are playing in the humanitarian response, including supporting the processing of visas for Ukrainian refugees? And can I also ask him, alongside all the military equipment, is the UK looking at delivering potassium iodide to civilians in Ukraine?
Just on medical supplies, I know my friend, the Right Honourable, the Health Secretary, has provided significant amounts of health stocks, but I'm very happy to look at that further for her. Look, on the issue of visas, we've offered, and any request from the Home Office we have fulfilled. If they ask for more, they'll get more, if that is what is required to speed up that process.
Stephen McPartland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to pay tribute to our brave Ukrainian friends and commend the Secretary of State on his steadfast support for them. Stevenage is home to NBDA, which manufactures brimstone. Can the Secretary of State clarify whether or not we will be making brimstone available? And also, what can we do to upgrade the Ukrainians' advanced cyber capabilities to disrupt Russian communication command and control?
I'm grateful to my friend. On the latter, I can't really comment on those sort of operational issues. I think all I would say is Britain and Ukraine have had a long-held cyber relationship many years before this invasion, and we continue to understand their cyber needs. MBDA have done an amazing job. The multinational consortium, including BAE and others, in those making of those weapon systems which are being used right now. As I've said, I don't have any objection in principle to some of the brimstone variants being deployed into Ukraine. And in principle, we agreed to sell brimstone anti-sea some months ago, 18 months, 2 years ago. If we do decide to put brimstone in, we will, of course, make sure that both the chairs of Select Committee and the front benches are notified. They are still a short-range missile. They have the Block 1s of a range of about 7 kilometres. They're not, they're not strategic. And I think the honourable member opposite, who asked a question about short defensive and offensive, I think what we've moved now to is tactical versus strategic. We're still not in a strategic place. A brimstone would be a tactical weapon system with its range, but nevertheless a very, very efficient and capable system.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will have seen the recent Defence Select Committee report, which was very critical of the government's decision to deploy the Royal Navy in terms of basically taking over border force and dealing with the small boats issue. It defined that policy as ill-defined and prematurely announced. What assessment has he made of the risk that the Operation Isotrope could lead to the diversion of scarce Royal Navy resources at this time, where the focus surely has to be on our national security and on deterring Vladimir Putin's aggression?
Tuesday.
The honourable gentleman will be relieved to know that none, the P2000 patrol boats, weren't going anywhere other than the UK shores, or indeed inland, inshore, so not inland vehicles, nor were the Batch 1 OPVs. They weren't going to go anywhere else. The rest of it has really been about bringing a military command and control mindset and the ability to mass and mash together intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities to have a better command and control umbrella over the whole thing. That's what we're trying to do. That's what we're starting to deliver. And it's as much about a cultural change as it was anything else.
Not possible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On a recent visit to Georgia with the APPG, we saw joint working between Georgian troops and NATO personnel, largely from the countries that he referred to earlier. Could you say a little more about the joint working that we're doing with Ukrainian forces to enable them to use to maximum effect the very valuable military equipment that the UK is providing?
State.
The Georgians are very important partners for us around the Black Sea, and obviously they themselves know what it's like to be at the wrong end of a Russian invasion, and it's very important that we help Georgia as resilient to that. It's important that we also recognise that having consolidated what Russia then tries to do in those countries, such as Georgia, which is divide, corrupt, and continue to manipulate, and that's why it's very important that Britain's relationship with Georgia is a long and enduring relationship to help them with their own resilience.
Williams.
Delivering the defensive equipment which has been so vital to Ukraine's success in resisting the Russian invasion has been really instrumental, and I think the government deserves all credit for its work in this respect. Because the Secretary of State states what are the UK's current overarching aims in this conflict, and confirm that support for Ukraine will continue long-term irrespective of who occupies number 10.
Look, I am grateful, thank you for his comments. Look, our objective is to push or help Ukraine push back Russia from both its actions since February, and if Ukraine takes a choice to continue to try and push Russia out of its illegally occupied territories, then of course the West and the international community will stand by them in doing that. I think in its simplest form, Britain wants to help Ukraine be free to choose. What it chooses is slightly secondary to the fact it has the freedom to choose in the first place as a sovereign state. That's what we're all trying to work for, and the only person who doesn't want to do that is Russia.
Rebel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the main lessons from this conflict seems to be that, alongside the courageous resistance of the Ukrainian people and the military, one of the reasons it hasn't gone to plan for Russia is because of the failure of their logistics, seemingly running out of food, fuel and other supplies. Could my right honourable friend confirm that one of the lessons that we will learn, and the whole world should learn from this, is that top-quality logistics, such as the UK armed forces have, is even more essential, perhaps, than military manpower?
It's really important, and we see from photographs Russian soldiers going to war with not much equipment, with poor equipment, rations that are years out of date, not just a few days or weeks, and all of that has a horrendous effect on morale. We see them at war with cheap handheld radios, not their own radios because they don't work, and we see them badly prepared. Bad battle preparation leads to defeat often. That's often the mess they're in. You saw some very expensive equipment got stuck in the mud because they used cheap tyres from somewhere else. Those things matter. It's also an important lesson for our defence that sometimes the less sexy things are actually the things you should invest in. They're often the things first cut when the Treasury comes calling and you pay for it in the end.
Ben Bradshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is he concerned, though, that if Putin is allowed to retain the territories in the south and east that he has invaded, that he will claim that and be able to claim that to some extent as a kind of victory? And in that context, what does he think of the comments of retired General Philip Breedlove, the former NATO commander in Europe today, who said now might be the time to at least consider, by NATO or a coalition of the willing, troops on the ground in the north and west of Ukraine so that your Ukrainian resources are freed up to fight in the south and east?
It's definitely a valid suggestion insofar as if we were to fast forward to a frozen conflict where 80% of Ukraine was still sovereign Ukraine, then it is entirely up for Ukraine to decide who it wants to invite onto its territory and for what purposes, just like us being there as we were under Orbital. I mean, people seem to forget that until this invasion, Ukraine was this sovereign country, yes, with two occupied parts, but if Ukraine wanted British soldiers, as it did, it had Swedish soldiers, it had Canadian on its territory. We went exercising with 5 Airborne Brigade, last year, etc. It's all possible to do, and I think, if Putin decides to hunker down into some form of further frozen conflict, we should remember two things. One is he'll be back for more, because that's what he did in 2014. And the second thing is he still doesn't control Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is Anzac Day, when we commemorate the sacrifice of Australians and New Zealanders in conflict. Will my right honourable friend join me in paying tribute to those who lost their lives at Gallipoli and since? And will he agree with me that Australia and New Zealand are important partners in supporting Ukraine now, not least with New Zealand's Hercules aircraft and crew, which recently arrived in the UK?
Yes, I think it's really important to remember the sacrifice made by New Zealand and Australia, effectively in a theatre of a war so far away. It's also important to recognise their solidarity to this conflict. Australia has given the United Kingdom funds to help purchase equipment for Ukraine. Australia and New Zealand recognise that this is really a war of values. This is a battle to show that the despot cannot win and must not be allowed to win, and they are doing everything they can to stand by us. We shouldn't forget that. We should also be very grateful for it.
Ready? Mr. Speaker, how much of his department's spending in Ukraine is being counted as official development assistance, and what steps is he taking to make sure that ODA spending by other departments is not being spent at the expense of other situations around the world that are in desperate need of aid?
I understand the plough is trying to, the path is trying to plough, whatever it is. Look, well, I'll send you a letter. I don't think any, from what I can tell. It certainly doesn't appear in my submissions that this is a category, this is a diversion. This is simply, what can we help the Ukrainians? How much is it costing? Can we afford to take risk in our own supplies? If not, can we buy it from someone else? And will the Treasury reimburse us? It's really simple.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State is absolutely right to salute the bravery of the heroic Ukrainian forces and to highlight the failures of the Russians, but we shouldn't in any way allow that to enable us to be complacent about the threat that they continue to provide. I hear what the Secretary of State said about the Ukrainians deciding at where we go from here, but does he agree with me there can be no return to normality of relationships with Russia until they've got out of all of the areas that they've invaded during this invasion?
There can be no return to normality for President Putin and his inner circle. What they have done, despite international warning from presidents and prime ministers endlessly asking them not to do it, is they have built their own cage and they're living in it. And from my point of view, they need to remain in it.
Christian Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We've seen already that the war in Ukraine is not going to be brief. Neither are Vladimir Putin's intentions going to be limited. So with that in mind, can the Secretary of State tell us if the government is beginning to look long-term strategically about the implications of Ukraine and the ambitions of Vladimir Putin?
Yes, I think there are two parts to this. One is, how do we, in some form of commission or get together to help plan Ukraine's long-term defence, its posture and its equipping of itself, because just like any other army, it will be exhausted and worn out. But also when it comes to rebuilding that country. It'll be very important that we don't forget, when all this is over, that we have to rebuild that country. We have to help them rebuild that country, not just Britain, not just the EU, not just the international community, but also over a long term. Russia is destroying things. You only have to see the photographs, that you don't rebuild them in a few weeks. And so if the international community is serious about sending a message to Putin, it's not just militarily now, it's about long-term development and the access to economic freedoms and prosperity that will demonstrate the difference between Russia and Ukraine.
David. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Within the very near future, it seems to be extremely likely that both Sweden and Finland will apply to join NATO. Can the Secretary of State indicate to the House what commitments we have given as a country to stand by Finland and Sweden should they face Russian aggression?
Irrespective of whether they join NATO, I talked earlier about the Joint Expeditionary Force. For me, it's inconceivable or incomprehensible that Britain would not, for example, go to the aid of Sweden should it be attacked or invaded. It is a fellow European country. It is a country with huge links to our country and the same values, etc. And one of the reasons that JEF is such an important grouping of nations, both Finland and Sweden, plus 8 NATO countries, is that we totally share the values. We have the same professionalism in our armed forces, and capabilities. Britain signed, I think, an MOU in 2014 originally with Sweden to further our defence cooperation. We're working to see what more we can do in the very near future.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker. Ukraine is facing a financial crisis, with the FT reporting that revenues are around a half of pre-war levels, with a fiscal gap projected to be $7 billion for this month alone. The IMF have approved an administered account for countries to make donations through a secure vehicle. Has the UK made a contribution to the account, and what efforts are being made with partners to provide Ukraine with hard cash?
So state.
Well, I can't tell you. I know we've given aid, I think over £100 million in aid, but as far as the sort of IMF fund, I can write to the honourable member with those details. I know the United States, I think, announced a significant amount of funding for Ukraine only over the weekend, but he's absolutely right. That's as much where we need to focus as on the military aid.
Margaret Farley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for his statement. The International Atomic Energy Authority have announced that they will be undertaking a mission to Chernobyl after gunfire in the area raised concerns of the potential for a major radiation leak. Can the Secretary of State confirm what discussions he has had with the IAEA and what they expect to find there?
So, if I'm not mistaken, the relationship with the IAEA is the Foreign Office and the BAEs, but I will be happy to find out for her. Of course, we're concerned about activity around Chernobyl and anything else, and I don't think it was by accident Russia did what it did around Chernobyl.
That ends that statement. But before I call the Minister to make a statement on the Government's response to the fan-led football review of football governance, I have to put on record my disappointment that the Government has apparently already trailed its response extensively to the media. It seems to me that we have a very courteous Minister that somehow Downing Street seems to ignore and decide to put everything that this House should hear first out of the media. It's not satisfactory, and I've got to say, not only is it discourteous to this House, it's discourteous to the honourable member for Cheltenham and Aylesford, who has put in so much work in this area. And the fact that anybody could believe that you could cut out the member must be very, very disappointing, because I'm going to tell you now that it will be, when she catches my eye, given more time in which she can put the case on all the hard work that she's done. And it might just be a lesson for government to stop being discourteous. Think about the people who get elected. That's on all sides. So please, I don't blame the Minister. I know that Downing Street love getting these messages out on a Sunday night. It's somehow, why have they not recognised that even the Prime Minister is a member of this House? It might be good for us all to hear it first. So like I say, it's not normally the case that the member will be given extra time, but I'm reassuring the honourable member and the House that more time will be given. Right, Minister.
We'll get this way. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, can I say first of all I accept your comments. I certainly mean no discourtesy to this House, and I will be having discussions about your comments with colleagues. With your permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to make a statement setting out the Government's response to the independent fan-led review of football governance. This is further to my written statement issued earlier today. The Government's response has been provided in hard copy to the Vote Office, and I will also be placing a copy in the libraries of both Houses. And at the start, I would like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Chatham and Aylesford, for all her hard work, and indeed the work of the entire panel for their diligence in this review, and indeed thank colleagues from across the House and all stakeholders who have debated these matters at length, in many cases for a number of years. But most importantly, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to thank the dozens of clubs and thousands of football fans from across the country who contributed to the review. They sit at the heart of the review and our response to it. Football is a defining part of our national identity and has been a central part of British life for over a century. English football has had some extraordinary success. Our Premier League has grown to become the most watched sports league in the world. However, good governance of our clubs has not kept pace with this expansion and development. The football pyramid itself has come under threat in recent times, with clubs risking collapse. And many fans have felt alienated from their own clubs. It's obvious that reform is needed to keep our national game alive and thriving. And this government has already taken strong action to support the reform of football. This includes financial support to help clubs through the pandemic and amendments to competition law to provide financial stability to English football. But we also committed to undertaking a review of football governance in our manifesto, a review led by fans for fans, a review to protect the future of professional football in this country. In late November, the independent fan-led review of football governance published its report. And I'm today pleased to announce the publication of the government's response to that report. Our response acknowledges the clear case for reform and sets out our approach to move forward. It marks a significant step in protecting our national game. Today, I am confirming that the government will introduce an independent regulator for football in law as part of a wider plan for reform. An independent regulator is just one of 10 strategic recommendations set out in the report, and I am pleased to say that the government will endorse all of the review's strategic recommendations. Some of these are for the government to implement, and some are for the football authorities to take forward, and we expect them to take action too. As well as surveying thousands of fans directly, the review benefited from over 100 hours of engagement involving representatives of over 130 clubs. This all built a clear picture of the challenges in the game. The review and our response are for them, for the fans who make our national game what it is and without whom football would be nothing. To coincide with the response, we are also publishing the findings of a government-commissioned study by academics and football finance experts Kieran Maguire and Christina Philippou. Their analysis confirms that there is a widespread issue of fragile finances across English football clubs and that action is needed to secure the sustainability of the game. The sum total of our plans amount to significant reform, and in our response we are committing to publish a white paper in the summer which will set out further details of the implementation of this reform. Through a new financial regulation regime, the regulator will usher in a new era of financial competency and sustainability for our clubs. We also recognise that who runs our football clubs goes hand in hand with how they are run. And so the regulator will establish a new owners and directors test, replacing the 3 existing tests, to ensure that only good custodians and qualified directors can run these vital community assets. The strengthened test will include a new integrity test. Recent events have shown the importance of us having confidence in the custodians of our clubs. Fans also have a crucial role to play in the future of football in this country, and for that reason we believe fans should be properly consulted by their clubs on key decisions, and therefore the regulator will set a licence condition setting out a minimum level of fan engagement to ensure clubs are meaningfully engaging fans. We also acknowledge that the crucial role that football clubs play in the identity of this country, and particularly in the communities that are so intrinsically linked with their local teams. The stadium, colours and badge are an integral part of this. Therefore, we believe they should have additional protections, including a mechanism for fans to consent before any changes are made to these key items. Madam Deputy Speaker, our manifesto commitment was instigated by the financial jeopardy that so many clubs were being pushed into. The long-term health of professional football in this country is dependent on fairer distributions throughout the football pyramid. That is why we agree that the Premier League should strengthen its support across the football pyramid. We expect further action from the football authorities on this important recommendation, and if they don't come to an agreement on financial flows through the pyramid, we reserve the right for the regulator to have powers in this area. Football also needs to ensure there is a clear and supportive pathway for players. That is why we agree with the recommendations that the welfare of players exiting the game needs to be better protected. I have asked the football authorities to act with urgency on this matter. Taking forward these recommendations and securing the future of football is a key priority of this government, but this is a priority that stretches beyond football. The review contains actions specifically for the Football Association, the Premier League, the English Football League and the Professional Footballers Association, on which we expect to see action without waiting for government legislation. Madam Deputy Speaker, the majority of the review looked at issues related to the men's game. Women's football has gone from strength to strength over the last few years, with a record number of tickets sold for this year's European Women's Championship to be hosted here in England. The government has shown that we are right behind women's sport in every aspect, and so we will launch a dedicated review of women's football in this country. As well as the Women's Football Review, I am pleased to confirm that the FIFA Women's World Cup and UEFA European Women's Championship finals will also be added to the listed events regime. And as a result, the tournaments will continue to be available to free-to-air television broadcasters, hopefully inspiring the next generation of Lucy Bronzes and Ellen Whites. Madam Deputy Speaker, the changes we have set out represent a real turning point for football and will have considerable impact on clubs. It's crucial that we get this right to give confidence to fans and future investors going forward. That is why we will set out further details on how reforms will be implemented in a white paper in the summer, and we are committed to legislate to make football reform a reality. We will implement the reforms as soon as possible. We are paving the way for a more sustainable, accountable and responsible future for football, one that ensures fans are front and centre of our national game, and I commend this statement to the House.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Minister for his statement and for advance sight of it. And can I also thank the Honourable Member for Chatham and Aylesford and all those who contributed to her excellent and timely review of our national game. Firstly, can I welcome the confirmation that the Government are supporting the strategic recommendations in the fan-led review. Labour have been calling for the plans to be fully implemented ever since the review was published, and in particular, the independent regulator for English football, which is key to reform. But however the Government tries to spin it, today's announcement of a white paper and further delay will come as a disappointment to fans. The fan-led review is a rigorous and wide-ranging piece of work based on engagement with every possible interest group, alongside over 20,000 individual fan responses to a survey, supported by an expert advisory panel from the world of football. As the DCMS Minister, doing the media rounds this morning, rightly said, there's been huge input from fans up and down the country. So, 11 years after the Select Committee report, 3 years after the collapse of Bury, a year after the disastrous European Super League proposal, and 5 months after the publication of the fan-led review, we don't need further consultation or a roadmap. We need a clear timetable, and we need new legislation to be included in the Queen's speech in 15 days' time. The need for urgent action is clear. Oldham Athletic were relegated from the English Football League on Saturday after years of mismanagement ending in fan protests. Derby County is in an ongoing crisis and were relegated from the Championship this week, not because the players aren't good enough, but because of bad owner management and governance. Two historic clubs, founding members of the Premier and Football Leagues respectively, hit hard because of reckless owners. In the wake of the Ukraine war and sanctions, Chelsea is in limbo. Many supporters want the review recommendations to be incorporated in its sale. The Government is missing an opportunity to embed fan representation as recommended in the review and give supporters a say on changes to the heritage assets of the club. The Minister's statement, while welcome, left some questions unanswered. The Minister could not rule out to the Select Committee recently that a regulator might be located within the FA. Can he do so now? We believe it is vital for the regulator to be truly independent. The statement confirmed the Government is accepting all 10 of the strategic recommendations. Good. Can he confirm that the Government supports the 47 detailed recommendations from the report, or perhaps more importantly, any it does not support? The announcement today will do nothing to break the impasse on redistribution of funding. The fan-led review gave the Premier League and the EFL until the end of 2021 to work it out between them, which hasn't happened. The bodies have not been able to come to an agreement on this for months. If they fail, the review proposes action from the regulator, But on current timescales, unless the Minister can tell me otherwise, a regulator won't be in place until at least 2024. At what point will he intervene urgently to get the Premier League and the EFL to a place where there is an agreement? The dedicated review of women's football, which was an important recommendation of the review, is really welcome. Can the Minister give us any more detail? Who will chair it? What timescale it might follow? And how will any of its recommendations be taken forward in due course? Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government have said all along, quite rightly, that they accept in principle the proposals of the review. So let's get on and do it. We're already too late for Bury, Derby and Oldham. If further clubs go under or suffer because of delays to the implementation of the review, responsibility will rest partly on the Government's shoulders. The Labour Party is happy to work with the Government to find space for legislation sooner rather than later. The right result is already clear. We don't need extra time. For the future of our national game, let's see legislation in the Queen's speech and action as quickly as possible.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his comments, and can I also put on record thanks and gratitude for the genuinely positive and constructive tone we've had from him, the opposition DCMS team, and indeed members across the House, because there is a clear cross-party intent to move forward here. I will definitely say to the Honourable Gentleman there is no intent to delay. What we want to do is move forward as soon as possible here. I say the White Paper is not an unusual step to take when bringing legislation to the House, and also it will give the opportunity for others to make additional comments as we move to the final stages of what is one of the most fundamental transformations in English football. It's also important that we get this right. It is incredibly complex. We are going to be bringing in incredible rigour and discipline, particularly financial discipline, on clubs that has not happened before. And if we were expected to bring these regulations in tomorrow, that could cause considerable difficulty for clubs who are perhaps not in the current position to be able to prove that level of discipline and rigour on the finances that we would be seeking under a new world with more regulation and with financial regulation. So we have to do it at the right time and give adequate notice. That said, we do want to move at speed, and the team at DCMS are all working on many of the aspects he's raised. Many of the points he's raised, further details will be coming in the White Paper. We'll also be announcing in the next few weeks further details on the review for the women's game, which has some similar but many different issues as well, and therefore that was right that it was a separate review. We'll continue to put pressure on the Premier League and others to move forward in the many areas that he identified where it does not require regulation, and in fact actually we expect many of the entities to move forward, for example, in areas of financial distribution, on fan engagement, and indeed on heritage assets. Football entities can continue to move that forward, and I am sure the whole House will continue to bring pressure on them to do so. But I thank him for his generally constructive comments and welcome the overall support that we are hearing from the opposition.
Tracy Crotch. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I say from the outset that I'm grateful to Mr Speaker for his comments at the start of this statement. I appreciate that with Chorley Town in the playoffs, that he has a deep interest in the future of football. And I know you, Madam Deputy Speaker, with great community clubs like Buckhurst Hill and Epping Town, share the concerns and thoughts of many colleagues here. I won't test your patience. I will take a minute or so, but I will not try and recognise that people have lots to say, and I know that I will have a meeting with the Minister to go through some of the detail of the report. Madam Deputy Speaker, regardless of any result on the pitch over the weekend, today is a good day for football fans. There have long been concerns about the regulation and governance of football clubs throughout the English football pyramid, much of which has come on the back of various crises, which in some cases has seen the disintegration of clubs due to financial mismanagement that led to the fan-led review into football, which I was privileged to chair. I'm enormously pleased that the Government has accepted or supports all 10 strategic recommendations set out in the review, including the fundamental proposal to establish an independent regulator free from the vested and conflicted interests that currently govern the game. It is perfectly possible to simultaneously celebrate the global success of English football while at the same time have deep concerns about the fragility of the wider foundations of the game. Implementation of better regulation, stronger governance and a more involvement for fans does not threaten the success of our game, but will make it stronger than ever. All that said, and with the indulgence of the Speaker, I am concerned about the time frame for implementation and seek clarity on a few points. Will the Minister confirm that the White Paper will be this side of summer recess? Summer can mean a lot of things in government parlance, quite often what we in the public think of as autumn. So will he confirm that it will be this side of recess? Will he rule out that the independent regulator will be housed in the FA? Can he clarify whether the owners and directors test will be split into two as per the review's recommendation? And does he share my disappointment that there has been no progress on discussions between the football authorities on redistribution and parachute payments? Could he outline his position on the transfer solidarity levy? And finally, the review was clear that fans should have a right of consent as part of the golden share on heritage items. But this is not so clear in the government's response. So could he confirm that there will be a veto for fans on heritage matters? There is much to congratulate the government for on today's announcement, and I would pay particular tribute to the officials who have worked hard on this response. Momentum is on the side of reform, but like most football fans, I'm always fearful of two things: 1-0 scorelines with time to play, and games that head into extra time. Given that both football and politics can be volatile and vulnerable to sudden change, I would encourage the government to nail the win for millions of fans across the pyramid and deliver the reforms as quickly as possible.
Minister. Well, again, I'd like to thank my honourable friend for all of her work, not just on the recent review, but her passion for football ever since she came into Parliament and indeed before. And I'd also like to thank her for acknowledging the hard work of the officials who've been working on this for many years in many cases as well. She's right to point out the complexities. I completely understand the potential frustration over timing and implementation here. But as I said in answer to the honourable gentleman opposite, this is complex. We will be having a white paper. We will be outlining further details shortly. I note her comments about the definition of the summer, and I can say that I will put pressure on to bring back further information as soon as possible. On the points regarding the FA, actually I think in her report she did leave it open that the FA might at some point in the future possibly be a home for the regulator. We explicitly didn't rule in or out any individual entity, but it is obviously quite clear that there will be requirements in terms of the scope, responsibilities, duties, purpose of the regulator, and therefore it's highly likely that some entities may be eligible and others won't. And again, I will be able to comment in due course on that. In particular, at the Select Committee, the views of many members of that committee and indeed the House have been expressed that they would not like it to see the FA take on those responsibilities, though the FA will obviously continue to have other responsibilities. In the other areas she mentioned, financial redistributions, the Secretary of State and I had meetings with Rick Parry of the EFL and Richard Masters of the Premier League just last week, where we reiterated the need for them to come to some agreement as a matter of urgency, and per her recommendations, if they don't, we will act, and we expect to see action before the white paper is released this summer as well. So we are hoping to see movement there, and if there isn't movement, then that will be another role for the regulator. And on the other point she raised, they will indeed be licensing conditions in these areas, including relating to fan engagement and also heritage assets and so on. The precise nature of those will be determined really, and could vary depending on the league and the level in the club. So we didn't want to be too prescriptive at this point, but we will make sure there is a licensing condition there. And I look forward to engaging with the Honourable Lady many times in the coming weeks.
Clive Efford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I too pay tribute to the member for Chatham and Aylesford. But can I ask the Minister, I really don't understand what he expects to find from a white paper that the fan-led review didn't find out. What is it that he is seeking to eke out from whoever didn't respond to or support the fan-led review? And in saying that, he says that we need, that finances are fragile. He's been in the room with the Premier League and the EFL together. He's just said that. So he knows that they are miles apart over the issue of parachute payments. They are distorting the Football League, and they need to end. So the government have got to make a decision about parachute payments and not keep kicking the can down the road and relying on an agreement between the Premier League and the Football League.
Again, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his passion about all things football. I wouldn't want to underestimate the complexity of what we're trying to do here, and therefore the need for a white paper. As I said, that is not an unusual part of parliamentary process. In fact, I suspect that if we hadn't proposed a white paper, I'd now be accused by the opposition of not bringing one in. So I think it's an important part of the process, because we can announce a regulator, we can announce the scope of the regulator, but then it goes to the complexities of, right, what's the scale, where's it located, what's the roles and responsibilities, what would be the sanctioning regime, what would be the appeals process. All of these things still need to be thought out, and we need to make sure we do it carefully, because we've got one chance to get this right.
Karen Bradley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I also pay tribute to my honourable friend for a fantastic piece of work. I know that football fans around the country will be thrilled today, and I think about Leek Town in the 8th tier of the pyramid, who will be very pleased to see the pyramid being strengthened by this work. But can I ask about the regulator? In my experience, regulators do not always deliver what government ministers want them to deliver. And given that this is an issue around finance, could I urge the Minister to look at successful financial regulation and perhaps base the regulator model on that?
Yes, I thank my right honourable friend for those comments, and I know she's got deep expertise and interest in this area as well. She's absolutely right, and we will be looking at models as we develop the regulator role. Of course, you know, you've seen the FCA, for example, and its role, for example, with the integrity tests and so on. So there's a lot of things out there that we will genuinely try and learn from, so that we don't start from scratch here, and we will we'll leverage expertise, and there is considerable expertise both at DCMS and throughout government on establishing regulators, but we will learn the lessons of the past.
David Linden.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I speak perhaps less as a Scottish MP and probably the sole member of Glasgow East Fleetwood Town Football Club Supporters Club. But I want to draw his attention to page 5 and 6 of the statement when he talks about financial distribution through the pyramids. The fact that he's not given that power to the regulator, I think, is something that would alarm quite a lot of people. But would you agree that it's not actually a parachute payment, it's a trampoline payment, isn't it?
Yeah, as I did outline and as recommended in the review, we should let football try and find a solution wherever possible. If they cannot find a solution, then there's a backstop, and that is what we're proposing.
Damien Green.
Deputy Speaker, can I congratulate the Minister, particularly on his wisdom of recognising that when faced with a series of suggestions from my honourable friend, the member for Chatham and Aylesford, it's easier and quicker just to say yes straight away. I'm a fan of a team in the Championship, indeed, a team, Reading, that is delighted to be in the Championship next season as well, and quite relieved. But what we all want, those of us who are fans of teams at every level, is a greater voice for fans, better management, better tests for people who take over clubs, but also to maintain the standards of the Premier League as a genuinely world-class competition, which it's become since it was created. Can my honourable friend reassure me that at all levels of the game, including at the top, there will be benefits from the new system of governance?
Absolutely. My right honourable friend makes very pertinent and wise points, including the very first point he made. But he's absolutely right. Football is a British success story, and the Premier League in particular is something we should all be proud of. It's incredibly successful around the world and brings in a lot of money for the UK economy. But by establishing greater stability and sustainability across the whole of the football pyramid, that is good for football overall, including the Premier League. The Premier League does distribute money, and we're very grateful for that, but we'd just like them to see do a little bit more.
Chiamora.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the Minister knows, because I have repeatedly raised it with him, the impact of the Premier League's arrogance and lack of accountability on Newcastle United fans. So I welcome his recognition of the need for reform. But will he confirm whether the delay, this further delay, is at the behest of the Premier League? And does he agree with me that for the Premier League to stand in the way of football fans is unacceptable and particularly distasteful given their policy director's recent fine for partying while football fans and indeed the rest of the country were in lockdown.
I'm afraid the Honourable Lady's misinterpreting the comments and what I've outlined here today. We have a process that we'll be pursuing. We have not announced delays, we've announced a route forward and therefore how we will proceed with this. And a white paper is a perfectly reasonable step, which we have to do because the issues are complex and we will be moving forward on all of these important areas.
Damien Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my honourable friend knows, if football clubs already traded within the rules of their competitions, many of them wouldn't get into difficulties. So, at this point, can you confirm a few points of principle? One, that the regulator will have the power to access in real-time financial information from the clubs to see if they're trading within the rules. That the owners and directors test won't just apply at the point of purchase. And the Minister's used several times the expression licensing conditions. Can you just confirm that his view at the outset is that the regulator will be issuing licences that it could rescind if the clubs don't comply?
Yes, I can confirm each of those points, and in particular the last point. A licensing regime is exactly that. In order to get a licence, you must abide by those conditions. And similarly, the other points he raised, he is accurate, including the point of principle around an owners and directors test. One of the problems has been, once a club's sold, there's been an owners and directors test, and then that's been it. We will be looking at greater frequency for the reasons he outlined.
Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure the Minister will join me in congratulating Warrington Rylands, who won promotion over the weekend as champions of the Northern Premier League West, and in sending best wishes to Warrington Town, who are in the playoffs for promotion from the Northern Premier League tomorrow. Both teams have aspirations for becoming league clubs, something that would be absolutely huge for football in Warrington. But media reports suggest that the government plans to leave the redistribution of wealth throughout the football pyramid to the football authorities rather than implementing the review's recommendation of a solidarity transfer levy. Given that the Premier League and the EFL have not been able to come to an agreement on this for months, will the Minister personally intervene to secure a solution rather than waiting for action from a regulator that doesn't yet exist?
Join her in congratulating the Warrington teams, obviously something in the water up there. And regards to redistribution, I'll repoint the point I made. I've already had conversations, and the Secretary of State's already had conversations with the Premier League and EFL, and we've requested that they work together to try and find a solution with redistribution. If they do not come to a conclusion, then we reserve the right for that to be part of the responsibilities of the regulator. So let's be very clear here. There will be changes to financial distribution. It's a matter of when and exactly how, but it will happen.
Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I join in the praise to the Right Honourable Member for Chatham and Aylesford for her incredible work for football, and as she says, it's a good day for football fans. And while I'm on my feet, I extend my congratulations to Forest Green Rovers, who were promoted to League One this weekend. Again, very happy fans locally. But the fan engagement has been absolutely crucial to get to this point and to influence the recommendations. So can I understand from the Minister whether football fans are going to be able to comment further and be heard ahead of the legislation being put before us?
Well, indeed, I'll congratulate Forest Green Rovers as well. And she makes the very important point, of course, why we're all here, why we're doing this, is because fans are at the heart of this. And we will continue to engage with fans, and I will do so with both clubs and the fan authorities as we go forward. And, of course, that is one of the advantages of moving forward with the White Paper. As we get close to that final details, just before legislation, there will be an opportunity for fans to comment. That's a good thing.
Ian Mearns.
Very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I also add my thanks and congratulations to the Honourable Member for Chatham and Aylesford. I would add, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I must declare an interest, as I am Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Football Supporters, supported by the Football Supporters Federation as the Secretariat. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the review was published in November, and we welcome the announcement of an independent regulator, but the list of failures, points deductions, relegations, that list grows. And we have an English Football League with clubs laden with debt, outspending receipts on players' wages, and an FA and HOC of the Premier League paralysed by self and sectional interests. So why the delay? Fans of many clubs will want to know why. When we say act now, what we mean is bring forward a bill that can be discussed in Parliament in the next session. The review included significant consultation, so why delay any further? Potentially, this will allow more horses to bolt, and it might be too late to close stable doors. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would add, Gateshead play away at the Chorley next Monday, hoping to clinch the National League North title.
Who won?
I think we may be playing club bingo in the chamber today, Madam Deputy Speaker. I can assure the honourable gentleman the intention is to move forward as soon as possible, as fast as possible, but I would not want to underplay the complexity of what we're doing or the scale of the changes that we are proposing today, and that requires that we get this right.
Chris Grayling.
Mr. Speaker, and can I join honourable members in congratulating my good friend from Chatham and Aylesford for a fantastic job and having a real influence in the future direction of the game. I refer members to my entry in the register as a regular but very frustrated this season Manchester United supporter. But I would say my focus today is very much on the small non-league clubs in areas like the one I represent, who drive the football pyramid actually down into the mini-leagues as well, and are crucial in the role they play in encouraging young people to get involved in playing football, but also just to get involved in sport. So can I ask the Minister to make sure that he puts together his white paper, he has that in mind. We need to protect small clubs, we need to protect the role they play in their communities, and we need to protect the role they that they play in encouraging a new generation into sport.
Yeah, my right honourable friend's making some really important points, and of course we don't forget the importance of grassroots and the non-league games, and of course the government is investing in grassroots with new facilities right across the country. And also the point he makes about the viability of the overall pyramid and therefore the trickle down, including through schemes such as the Football Foundation, are vitally important, which is why financial sustainability and success at the top is expected to help the entire pyramid.
Jamie Stone.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. As a Scot and as a Highlander, it will come as no surprise to the Chamber that I support Ross County. And Ross County very nearly won a Scottish Cup final, but were pipped to the post by Dundee United. It was on the 15th of May 2010, and I remain deeply traumatised by the result. I was there, and I was greatly saddened. My point is this, that from little oaks, mighty oaks can grow. It wasn't always thus with Ross County. I can remember them being thrashed by Rangers in the 1960s.
And the other way.
Quite enough from the sedentary gentleman from behind me. My point is this. I do seek reassurance. Nevertheless, I do accept what the Minister is saying about the good intention of the government on this front. I do seek reassurance that the clubs in the lower league, the lower divisions, are being consulted to the maximum point that they can be, because they are vital to this equation being solved.
Yeah.
Yes, I can assure the honourable gentleman, and actually the review, more than 20,000 people responded to the review, as well as 120 clubs consulted, and I travel up and down the country and consult with clubs on an ongoing basis, as indeed I think pretty much everybody in the chamber does as well. That always feeds back. Fans' views really matter to us here. And he's also alluding to the point that success at the top absolutely needs to trickle down as well. It's vital that works, and we want all levels of football to excel.
Jack Burton.
Speaker, I very much welcome these announcements, and our clubs locally, both Stoke City and Port Vale, are generally very well run in Stoke-on-Trent and do huge amounts for our communities across the city. So would my right honourable friend agree with me that it's important that we see this good practice and the investment that goes into our communities rolled out across all clubs, and that they lead by example and take from those fantastic examples that we see in Stoke-on-Trent?
He's absolutely right. Football clubs play a pivotal role in our communities, not only obviously the sport, but we saw during the pandemic the role that they played. Recently I had the privilege of going to some EFL awards where they communicated to me that over 4 million hours of volunteering have been provided by football just those 72 clubs over the last year. What an incredible contribution, and long may that continue.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Lancashire is home to many great football clubs, but often we have great rivalries. Last week I received a letter from Andy Higgins, who's the chairperson of Blackpool Supporters Trust, and the week before that I met with Steve Kerwood, the Chief Exec at Fleetwood Town Football Club. But one thing they agree on is that the financial pyramid is frankly not working. And with the Premier League and EFL in absolute logjams, is the Minister perhaps naively optimistic that he thinks the football authorities are going to be able to resolve this internally?
Well, I'm definitely usually a glass half full rather than a glass half empty person, but which I think is always a good way to go through life. I don't think I could be accused of being naively optimistic, but I do believe that they have a responsibility and an obligation to put the House in order and take action, and if they don't, action will be taken on them.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. AFC Wimbledon, of course, is the living example of a football club that is rebuilt after its heritage has been taken away by fans and community. And can I thank my right honourable friend for all of her work? She mentioned earlier in her speech about how the government's definition of summer is sometimes movable. The government's definition of engagement is also sometimes movable. So can I ask him to be clear that when the white paper comes out, the condition will set out very clearly what the expectation of fans should be on their engagement?
Yes, I thank my honourable friend for his comments as well. He's right, actually, that engagement could mean different things to different people. That's not necessarily a bad thing as long as we set a minimum level, and that will be the condition. We'll be looking at licensing conditions, and fan engagement might be different for, say, a Premier League club, top-end Premier League club, to a club further down the pyramid. And indeed, expectations of engagement may change as well. We will set some minimum conditions, and you know, one model may not fit all, but there will definitely be changes here.
Dan Carden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I say well done to my honourable friend for Chatham and Aylesford, and also say that my honourable friend, the member for Liverpool West Derby, would like to be here. He's done a lot with fans and supporters, but he's at his select committee. For all of us who want to see fan engagement embedded in the game, there will be real concern at the delay that is being taken by government. And I want the Minister to reassure fans that in the time we're waiting for legislation, vested interests will not be at the ears of ministers, and that we will see all of the recommendations in the fan-led review implemented.
Yeah. I think the very fact that we're making the announcements we are today, which are fundamental and transformative to English football, show that vested interest actually has not had a huge say here. We have led this review based on fans, on what is in the best interests of fans, and that will continue.
Jason Mackay.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm a very happy Huddersfield Town season ticket holder as we get ready for the Championship playoffs. I'm also delighted, as well as a Golkey United non-league season ticket holder, the Village got promotion from North West Counties League Division 1 this season. However, I am aware of the misery that fans of other clubs like Derby, Bury and Oldham Athletic, as we saw at the weekend, have suffered. But I do welcome this clear commitment to fairer funding between the leagues and to introducing an independent regulator. But can the Minister quickly tell me how this review and these proposals will make sure that fans of their local clubs don't have to suffer once again poor governance of their clubs that have put them under threat or even seen their clubs go out of existence?
Yeah, the Honourable Gentleman, again, is making really valid points, and that's really at the heart of what we're doing here. The role of the regulator is not to be there in and of itself, but for a purpose, and the purpose is to make sure that football is sustainable in the long run, with many, many elements covering financial regulation, governance, engagement with fans, treatment of heritage assets, and so on. All of those will be fundamental as part of the licensing condition, plus, of course, a new owners and directors test. All of that together should make sure that there's much less chance of clubs getting into difficulty, whether that's financial or in terms of their treatment of the fan base. So, as a package, it should achieve the very things he's looking for.
Debbie Abrams.
Thank you so much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I too pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Chatham and Aylesworth, for all the work that she's done. And as we've already heard, unfortunately, Oldham Athletic is the first founding member of the Premier League to drop out of the Football League. And this has really hit hard many of the fans of the town. So I share the concerns in terms of the delay And I'd also like to ask the following question on behalf of the Right Honourable Members for Ashton-under-Lyne and Oldham West and Royton. Can the Minister be more specific in terms of how long it will take to reverse the position where wealth sits at the top of football and fails to redistribute down into the lower leagues and allowing rogue owners to use clubs as their personal playthings?
Yeah, a great deal of sympathy for Oldham fans, and she's making important points. Many of the proposals we've outlined today should actually help and make sure that that kind of situation doesn't happen in the future. And as I've said repeatedly to colleagues today, what I'm announcing today is the progress and how we're moving forward. This narrative of delay, I'm afraid I do have to push it back against. This is about how we're moving forward.
Justin Tomlinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I also pay tribute to my fellow Panini football sticker collecting honourable friend for Chatham and Aylesford, and for the fantastic work that she's done and the fact there is general consensus for the majority of those recommendations. But we also mustn't lose sight of the fact that the Premier League is the most successful football league in the world. The Championship is the 4th biggest league. And if MPs are the answer, that fills me with trepidation, because there is a reason why we aren't all football managers and football pundits. So would the Minister agree with me that the Premier League, the EFL and the FA need to read the room and crack on pretty quickly?
I agree with him, and that is a message that we have sent. I'm not sure whether I agree with him, though, that there aren't football pundits in this House. I think there's quite a few sitting within a few feet of me.
Kim Ledbetter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will also announce myself as a very happy Huddersfield Town fan today, following our latest victory. But also, I hope the Minister will join me in congratulating Liversedge Football Club in my constituency, who were crowned league champions at the weekend. They're a fine example of a community club doing lots of good things in my constituency. Also, having joined the member for Chatham and Aylesford on the pitch against the Afghan women's football team recently, can I say what a great team player she is and praise her for her work on her excellent report. I support the call in the report for a new code for football club governance, and can I ask the Minister to ensure that such a code will apply to all clubs and include additional minimum requirements relating to directors, equality and diversity, fan engagement, welfare and stewardship?
Yeah, the Honourable Lady raises many points. It was a pleasure to meet the Afghan team as well the other day, and I'm glad to hear her also again highlight the importance of clubs in our communities. Further details will be coming on the white paper. I'm glad she also mentioned EDI, because of course that was part of the report, and we'll be looking at making sure that EDI plans are in place as well as part of this. So there's more information coming out, and I would say look out for it in the white paper.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that Grimsby Town, my club, who I've been supporting for 60 years, do play in Cleethorpes. We've talked a lot, Madam Deputy Speaker, about different tiers here, and the one thing I fear is that we might be having too many tiers of regulation, because clearly the FA and other bodies are going to play a part in regulating the sport. And the report talks about somebody who will regulate the powers and ensure that the regulator uses their powers proportionately. So who regulates the regulator?
I think the many points the Honourable Gentleman raises is exactly why it is that we're doing the right thing by providing further details in the white paper so we can see exactly what the remit responsibilities of the regulator would be. And he also raises a very important point, is there are other entities and bodies in football, and we need to be very clear where the roles and responsibilities lie. We've got a pretty good picture of that now, and over the next few weeks and months I'm sure it will be even clearer, hence the white paper.
Karen Smith.
Deputy Speaker, Bristol City are key to both the culture and the economy of South Bristol, and I recently met with the Chief Executive, who's very keen on the work by the Honourable Lady and to see that progress. Rivalry in the city is very intense, but can I draw the Minister's attention to supporting the work of Casmay and Lucy Ford, the founders of Bristol Rovers of Her Game 2, and can I press him a bit on the details of the review of women's football and hope that the work of Her Game 2 and all the women and girls involved in grassroots football is included in that review?
Yes, I thank the Honourable Lady. She's right, actually, this is a really, really important part, and actually to make sure that we do a proper review of women's football is pivotally important. I know has the support of the whole House. We will be announcing more information within the next few weeks. The scope will be different from the review of the men's game because the issues are slightly different. Football finance is always around there, but it's also other things, in particular sponsorship, visibility and so on, are pivotally important points. And so if I can ask the Honourable Lady to be patient just a little bit, and we'll be providing more information in due course.
Pauline Latham.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The proud and historic Derby County Football Club has had a torrid time over the last 7 months. They have a named buyer now, but they're not out of the woods. So I'd like to ask the Minister, is this the black and the white, and therefore he can guarantee that these proposals will guarantee that no club will close in the future?
Yes, I've had many conversations with the Honourable Lady about the situation in Derby County, and I know how passionate she and several other colleagues are about the situation there. I think what I can say is that we would be very confident that with the new regime, the independent regulator, in particular looking at the financial regulation aspects, the chances of clubs going into administration again and getting into that difficulty would be considerably reduced because, of course, there would be much closer scrutiny of the finances. As my honourable friend mentioned earlier on, this is a key point as well, this kind of ongoing, real-time looking at the finances will be pivotal here. But circumstances can change, emergencies can happen, both domestically and internationally. So could we guarantee that that this will guarantee no club will ever go under? No, we can't, but it will be massively impactful in terms of significantly reducing the chances of it happening.
Justin Batters.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Since the Glazer family became the owners of Manchester United, they have taken over £1 billion out of the club, much of it to service debts that they incurred buying the club in the first place, which they subsequently loaded onto the club. I don't think that kind of toxic business model's got any place in football or in any other business, so I hope the Minister will be able to confirm that that kind of arrangement under the new regulator will be banned altogether.
Well, as I said, financial regulation will be at the heart of what the independent regulator will do, and therefore looking in detail at the finances of clubs, the sustainability of clubs, how they're spending their money, will be at heart of the role of the regulator.
Scott Benton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister recently visited Blackpool FC, a club which he will know has suffered more than most at the hands of an irresponsible owner. I'm pleased to see that the Government is endorsing the key recommendations of the fan-led review, including the owners and directors test. However, he will know that financial circumstances, views and attitudes can change over time, including for the owners of clubs. And so does he agree that the owners and directors test should be applied periodically rather than just merely when a club is bought and sold?
Yes, I very much enjoyed visiting my honourable friend's constituency and visiting the club. He's absolutely right, and as outlined and highlighted in the report, it did say that we need to make sure that the owners and directors test isn't just static and happens when a club is sold, but actually is regularly reviewed because circumstances, as he outlined, do change. We will be looking at that, and actually I think in the report they suggested every 3 years. That sounds sensible to me, but we'll be providing more information in the white paper.
Alison McGovern.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the only thing better than working on this fan-led review of football with the member for Chatham and Aylesford is being on the football pitch with her. She's been absolutely brilliant, as I'm sure we all agree. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I know you would be concerned that given historic injustices in the world of football, that women should not be made to wait a moment longer than necessary. So further to the answer given to my friend for Bristol South, can I ask the Minister please just to explain why the chair and the terms of reference for the Women's Review wasn't announced before today, and if he can correct this situation and now at the dispatch box tell us who the chair is going to be and when we will have in our hands the terms of reference, because, Madam Deputy Speaker, women who care about football in this country do not want to wait any longer.
I can assure the honourable lady that women in sport is one of my top priorities, and when I became Sports Minister, one of the first things I did was set up a Women in Sport working group, which is making considerable progress, and I'm very proud and very appreciative of all the people involved in that. She will have to be just a little bit patient. I cannot announce at the dispatch box now who the chair will be and the scope. She'll understand that that will be released very, very soon, but I can absolutely communicate to her that this does not mean it is not a priority. It absolutely is.
Hugh Merrin.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I refer to my entry in the Register? A few years ago, I was lucky enough to secure an adjournment debate when my honourable friend, the member for Chatham and Aylesford, was in the Minister's position answering, and we were talking about the success of the Premier League, the 100,000 jobs that are directly held through the Premier League, the £7.6 billion it delivers to the UK economy, and the £3.6 billion it delivers to the Exchequer. There's nothing of that nature inside the government's response. Can I ask the Minister just to confirm that nothing in this response will harm and undermine this great export that is the Premier League?
Yes, I thank my honourable friend for that. In fact, if I remember correctly, I was PPSing that very debate, so I remember it well. He's absolutely right, and as I've said at the dispatch box today many times, the Premier League is an incredible British success story that we need to celebrate and applaud and make sure it continues to be successful. There is nothing that we're proposing today that should jeopardise that. We're asking for some changes. We've been asking for reform in football for a very long period of time, and unfortunately the reason why we've had to intervene, and we are doing so, is because they've singularly failed to act at the speed in which we needed it, and therefore we've had to intervene. The Premier League has an obligation and a responsibility to continue to make changes, including with financial flows, but I do not believe that anything we're announcing today would jeopardise what is an incredible success story, and the Premier League will continue to thrive. I'm very confident of that.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Anyone who's spoken to directors and owners of either Chesterfield Football Club or Staveley Miners Welfare will be very much aware that whilst there may be monstrous profits in the Premier League, at every level below that there is huge indebtedness, and football as a sport requires on benefactors to constantly be writing another cheque. That's a model that's broken. I fear that what we've heard today is that this has actually been kicked into the next Parliament, and I suspect that the Premier League clubs listening to this will be reassured that they still have quite a bit of time before they're going to be having their feet held to the fire. So can the Minister assure us that before this Parliament is over, in 2024, whenever that may be, that we will actually see reform on the statute book? It won't be something that's just relying on the next manifestos of parties at the next election, but will actually be dealt with in this Parliament.
Both the Secretary of State and I have said previously that the intention is to bring this in before the end of this Parliament, and I say we are working at speed on this. The point he makes about indebtedness is an important one. Many clubs are currently in a pretty precarious financial state, and the regulation and the financial regulation we will be bringing in will require much more stability and sustainability and proof of that sustainability, which is precisely why saying let's bring this in tomorrow could end up having the absolute opposite impact from what we intend.
Sarah Whitcliffe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Government's response to the fan-led review undertaken by my honourable friend for Chatham and Aylesford, and can I thank her for recently visiting Accrington Stanley and the supporters, and in particular my fantastic chairman Andy Holt, who people know is quite a vocal supporter of the fan-led review. But there are concerns about the timing of this, and the Minister has set that out. But whilst we are waiting for the white paper, can he make sure that we can continue to have discussions on the redistribution of finances?
Yes, indeed. It wouldn't be a debate in Parliament about football without mentioning Accrington Stanley. So I'm glad that bingo item has been ticked off. The Honourable Lady is right, and as I've said earlier, we are continuing to put pressure on the Premier League to continue the dialogue and the conversations, because we would like to see movement, and I would like to see movement before the white paper is released.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm proud that Luton Town, in my constituency, has been at the forefront of calls for fan-led reform, particularly through campaigns such as Fair Game.
And as a Lutonian and like many other fans, I've got everything crossed that we will not only just see them in the playoffs, but in the Premier League this season. But the Minister mentioned exiting the game. So many have the experience of devoting their lives to football, often at the expense of a proper education or other opportunities, only for that footballing career to end abruptly or to never really get started. So this can lead to severe mental health issues often and shocking life outcomes. So can the Minister give some further clarity over the expected White Paper's plans to better protect the welfare of players exiting the game, particularly those leaving football academies at a young age?
Well, the honourable lady will be aware that I fought Luton South in the 2010 election, and Luton South fought back, as they say. So I do still have great passion, though, for Luton, who has indeed gone up and down the leagues over many years. She's making a really important point, which the honourable member highlighted, member for Chatham and Aylesford, in her report, and which I referenced in my statement. This is one of the areas that is primarily a responsibility for football to sort out, but we are keeping a very close eye on it. The welfare of players is paramount, and we've seen too many failures in the past.
Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the heart of the mother town sits Port Vale FC, situated within Stoke-on-Trent, North Kisgrove and Torque. And this review is so important because we had a former owner, Norman Smurthwaite, who was completely a disaster and almost brought down this fantastic asset. But it's thanks to Kevin and Carol Shanahan, who came in and bought this club, that means that we're now sitting in 4th place, 1 point in League 2 off the automatic promotion spots. And as Carol says, we are simply a championship club that just happens to be in League 2 at this moment in time. But what's really important, and what Carol wanted me to reiterate, is that surely we should be looking at the TV rights. And rather than having the EFL and the Premier League competing against each other, get them to join up and have the 70-30 split.
Yeah. Well, as I said, the financial distribution, it was a pleasure to visit my honourable friend's constituency and visit the club. My honourable friend's making a really important point, and of course, as I've said repeatedly, financial distribution is something that we are looking at. We want and require the Premier League to work with others on this, and if they don't act, we'll look at alternative measures.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd also like to thank our honourable friend, the member for Chatham and Aylesford, for such excellent work on the review. Players give their lives for football. My constituent, the former captain of Leeds United, Brian Dean, was woefully let down by the footballing authorities. Will player welfare be central to the new regulator? We've got areas like the PFA where there have been recent failings, whether agents are fit and proper, whether the people who financially advise players are proper to do their work. Will the regulator take on board those issues, because they're absolutely important to players playing the game?
Yeah, the honourable members raising a variety of points. Some of those are likely to be the responsibility of the regulator, but many of the points he raises will continue to be the responsibility of other institutions within football who have responsibilities such as things as player welfare.
Jane Hunt.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Football is integral to Loughborough throughout the town clubs, among students, and of course in our exemplary Leicester City, with their training ground in Loughborough constituency, which the member for Strangford will be very happy about, I'm sure. Today is indeed a good day for football fans. Will football fans at all levels be able to comment further on the proposals before the legislation is introduced, and if so, how?
Yes, the view of fans is pivotal. It has been so far, and it will continue to be as we develop the proposals. So we will find ways to make sure that fans continue to be engaged in the conversations and the discussions, and we'll be announcing more information when we announce the white paper.
Mick Widley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've spoken about before of the importance of ensuring a genuine, fair and equitable distribution of wealth throughout English football, and the fan-led review rightly suggests that the Premier League should be doing more to support lower league and grassroots football, so that clubs like Tranmere Rovers in my constituency can continue to nurture the next generation of homegrown talent. But while a report's recommendation of a solidarity transfer levy is welcome, more needs to be done. Can the Minister inform the House what additional steps the government will be taking to guarantee that clubs like Tranmere, which are so often the beating heart of their communities, see more of the wealth flowing down from the top of the football pyramid?
Yes, this is a common appeal we've heard today. Is that the distribution, financial distribution in football, is not as it should be at the moment. We are appealing to the Premier League to do more. And as I said, if they can't come to some agreement, then we will look about what the responsibilities of the regulator may be to take further action.
I thank the Minister for his statement. Point of order, Owen Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, on the 28th of March, the House considered and agreed a motion in my name that this House believes that the current process for claiming war pensions and armed forces compensation payments is not fit for purpose and urges the Government to launch an independent inquiry into the system's failings. Following this debate, I submitted a parliamentary question to the Minister last week, seeking clarity on what steps they were taking to establish the agreed inquiry. This morning I received a written answer from the Minister for Veterans stating that there are no plans for an inquiry into the process for war pensions or armed forces compensation payments. The answer goes on as far as to claim that the process remains effective, fit for purpose and functionally satisfactory. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, if what we heard in the debate is anything to go by, then the Government's definition of satisfactory is very far removed from mine. Now, in terms of Erskine May, paragraph 20.96 tells us that every question, if agreed to, becomes an order or resolution of the House and is recorded as such in the Journal of the House. On this basis, could I seek clarity that the outcome of the debate from the 28th of March is indeed recorded as a resolution of the House, and seek your guidance on how to see this resolution translated into action?
Well, I'm grateful for the honourable member for giving me notice of his point of order. As he will know, I'm not responsible for ministerial answers. And whilst what he said about the resolution is that it is the opinion of the House, that was a non-binding resolution. Again, taking that a step further, I'm also not responsible for how ministers respond to non-binding motions of the House. However, the front bench, the Treasury bench, the whips will have heard what he has to say, and I'm sure that they will feed back his concerns. Point of order, Tracy Craig.
Madam Speaker, at the start of the Minister's statement, I was able to pay tribute to Mr Speaker and his team, Chorley Town, and their promotion efforts, and likewise Madam Deputy Speaker's community clubs in her constituency. And I wonder if Madam Deputy Speaker, you give me some advice on how I can get onto the record your own support for Doncaster Rovers Supporters Trust, who I know that you have met with and have allayed their concerns and indeed their desires for reform in football.
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her point of order. I thank her very much for her point of order, and I would also like to put on record how pleased I was to be able to have discussions with her about points that have been made to me about Doncaster Rovers, not only from the directors but also from the club supporters. So I'm very grateful to her for that point of order and for all the work that she's done in this area. Thank you. Point of order, Jim Shannon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, further to the point of order the Honourable Gentleman for Midlothian made, having participated in that debate on the Armed Forces Compensation Bill, there certainly was an indication and a flavour of intent from the Minister on that night to correspond and respond positively to what the Honourable Gentleman said. Madam Deputy Speaker, the concern I have is that I conveyed that flavour and that intent from that debate in the Hansard to my constituents, who will now feel grieved that what was shown and discussed on that night cannot now be delivered. What can I do to highlight that matter and ensure my constituents know when this House says something that it actually means it? Yeah.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for that point of order. Again, I would stress that the reality is that this was a non-binding motion. But first of all, the honourable gentleman has added to the has put it on record his concerns regarding this matter. Now, I'm sure if he went to the Table Office, they would be able to give him advice on other ways that he might raise this, I don't know, at the next appropriate oral questions or at the business statement. It might be something that he raises, but I'm afraid I can't really add much more to what was said previously. Thank you. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Police crime sentencing and courts bill, consideration of Lord's message.
Now. Financial privilege is not engaged by any of the items in the Lord's message relating to the police, crime, sentencing and courts bill. We will begin with the first government motion, as on the order paper, with which it will be convenient to consider the other government motions on the paper. I call Minister Kit Malthouse to move the motion.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the motion in the name of my Right Honourable Friend the Home Secretary and the associated amendments in lieu. Madam Deputy Speaker, we return yet again, I have to say with a smidgen of ennui and irritation, to the issue of police powers to attach the conditions to protest. It's disappointing that the debate on these provisions continues to be characterised by misinformation and irrationality about what the bill actually does. Madam Deputy Speaker, I shall start with the issue of noise. As I said at round 2 of ping pong, at the opposition's behest, we have added provisions to the bill that can be used to limit noise and disruptive protests outside schools and vaccination centres. I am therefore at a loss to understand why they wouldn't agree to these provisions outside, say, a convent or a hospital or an animal sanctuary or, God forbid, a factory. What happened to the workers' rights? It cannot be the case that a protest can inflict any amount of noise on those living or working in the vicinity for prolonged periods of time, day or night. I agree it would not be necessary or proportionate, for example, to attach conditions relating to the generation of noise to a procession, which will pass a particular location within a matter of hours. But the same cannot be said of an ongoing raucous protest, perhaps encamped in a residential area, which includes the banging of drums and the use of loud hailers. It is intolerable that local residents should have to endure that day and night, and it is right that in circumstances such as these, the police should have the power to act. I do not understand, Madam Deputy Speaker, why those residents' rights are so lightly set aside by the opposition. And when the Honourable Lady rises to address the motion, I hope she will answer that question. I can, though, Madam Deputy Speaker, assure the honourable members for North Antrim and for Belfast East that there are no new powers here to restrict what is said. They questioned me on this, I think, at the last round. And for that matter, sung. These provisions are simply about the harm caused by excessive noise. The content is irrelevant. Of course, the existing criminal law relating to hate or intimidatory speech will continue to apply, by all means.
LA80, I've a real concern. I'm not sure, Minister, whether my concern has been abated or whether, in fairness, my honourable friend from East Antrim or North Antrim, or sorry, East Belfast or North Antrim has been as well. Can the Minister give me an assurance on Hansard today in this House, on the record, that the letter of the law does not offer the protection for those who have open airs or other such events will not be affected, that instead gives officers the power to, as sadly been done in this country already, arrest those who are preaching the word of God. Can I seek an assurance from the Minister that under no occasions and under no circumstances will the opportunity to preach the gospel in the streets of this great kingdom will be in any way thwarted or reduced or restricted?
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I've already explained, the content of what is said is irrelevant for the purposes of this legislation. This legislation merely covers the distress that may be caused by the volume or persistence of the noise. The existing criminal law already covers content, obviously not in this case, but if it's intimidating or somehow hateful or inciting some kind of violence, there are already provisions against that kind of speech. But in the circumstances the honourable gentleman states of somebody simply preaching the gospel, which is not causing alarm or distress because of the level or the persistence of the noise, then I can't see why that would be offensive to anybody, or indeed that the police would use those powers. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, turning to the other provisions in Clause 56, enabling the police to attach any condition to a public assembly where they are necessary to prevent serious public disorder, serious damage to property, serious disruption to the life of the community, or intimidation, I welcome the belated acceptance by the other place that the existing powers in Section 14 of the Public Order Act are insufficient. But Lord's Amendment 87J, I'm afraid, is not up to the task. The police have told us that the distinction drawn in the 1986 Act between processions and assemblies is outdated and simply does not reflect current-day challenges of policing dynamic protests, which can morph from a procession to an assembly and back again. The current situation, I'm afraid, Madam Deputy Speaker, begs all sorts of questions. For example, how slowly would a procession have to move before it becomes static? If protesters walk, for example, in a 200-metre circle, is that a procession or a static process? I should stress that it will continue to be the case that any conditions must be necessary and proportionate to prevent serious disorder and the other serious harm set out in the legislation. None of this, however, is to say that we have not listened and reflected on the views expressed by the other place. In the last round, we raised the threshold for the exercise of the noise-related powers by removing the serious unease trigger, and we have now tabled an amendment in lieu which will place a duty on the Secretary of State to prepare and publish a report on the operation of the relevant provisions in clauses 55, 56 and 61 within 2 years of commencement. In one of our earlier debates, my right honourable friends, the members for Newark and for Hereford and South Herefordshire, stressed the need for post-legislative review of these provisions, and these amendments now enshrine that in law. Madam Deputy Speaker, we have reached the stage of the legislative process where the issue at stake is no longer simply about the merits or otherwise of the particular measures we are debating today. There is a more fundamental issue at stake, namely upholding the primacy of this elected House in our constitutional arrangements. This House has already debated and expressly approved the noise-related provisions on no less than 3 occasions: at report stage last July, on consideration of Lord's amendments at the end of February, and again at the end of March, not to mention the separate votes in second and third readings of the bill. I hope and expect that honourable members will now endorse these provisions for a 4th time when we come to the division in a short while. The other place, I have to say, composed as it is of hereditary and appointed members without any democratic mandate, has done its duty in asking this House to reconsider this issue. We have now done so and made our position abundantly clear. We should, Madam Deputy Speaker, send these provisions back to the Lords again, with a clear and unequivocal message that they should now let them and this bill pass. And I beg to move.
The question is the first government motion relating to the Lord's message on the police, crime, sentencing and courts bill as on the notice paper. Shadow Minister Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sorry the Minister finds himself bored by the democratic process, but it is the democratic process, and he sadly does have to come to the dispatch box to engage in this debate. There is one...
She wasn't shouting. I think the Honourable Lady was giving a speech. Sarah Jones, carry on.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't mind how loud and how noisy the Minister is, because I don't want to curtail his right to be as noisy as he likes. There's one topic that we're debating today, the right to protest and the right to make noise. Madam Deputy Speaker, we have indeed debated it several times. Members across this House have spoken passionately about this, why this really matters and why the government has got this so wrong. You might think, Madam Deputy Speaker, with crime up 40%, the arrest rate halved since 2010 and prosecution rates at an all-time low, that the government might spend its time on the bread and butter issues of law and order, fighting criminals, but instead they seem intent on criminalising singing at peaceful protests. It perhaps suggests that the government is tired, out of ideas and with no plan, searching around for anything eye-catching to distract from their years of failure. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Lords responded to the Minister's defence of his policy by voting against it again. Amendments 73 and 87 remove the government's proposed noise trigger, which would allow the police to put conditions on marches or one-person protests which are too noisy. We agree with the Lords, and we support the Leave Out Amendment 80 to remove the clause from the bill altogether. As with most government policies thought up on the hoof, there are so many questions about how the government's... I will give one.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way. This is honestly a genuine question. Right? I was, for many years, a councillor in Central London. I was a London Assembly member. I'm conscious that Central London is particularly targeted by protests. Right? They happen pretty much every weekend and often every day of the week. Central London is characterised by a quite dense residential population. Where is the balance between the rights of those residents to peaceful enjoyment of their homes and the rights of protesters to protest throughout the night, as she seems intent? Please explain to me why they don't deserve some kind of protection from noise.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would ask the Minister back, where is the evidence that residents have asked for this change in legislation? Where is the evidence... Madam Deputy Speaker, I see no evidence that anybody has asked for this change in the law, not least the police, which I will mention, well, my inbox, I don't know about the Minister's inbox, is full of emails asking us to vote against the government's clauses today. I haven't had a single one asking me to vote in favour. Yes, I will.
Thank you for giving way. I may be able to enlighten the Minister as to why there's no need for the noise clauses. The Minister for Social Justice in Wales, Jane Hutt, has been quoted as saying that the current legal framework provides sufficient scope already. This means there is no requirement or need to include a new, far more draconian measure. We've already got sufficient laws in place. There is no need for this. And this bill rides totally roughshod over the devolution settlement.
Yeah. My honourable friend is right, and I've been very proud to campaign with Jane Hutt, and she knows what she's talking about, and she delivers results, which is something that this government could perhaps learn from. The recently published guidance, we know, Madam Deputy Speaker, about this bizarre change to the law gives us a helpful tip that a noisy protest outside an office with double glazing may not meet the threshold in this legislation. This guidance is seriously asking the police to consider whether a protest is too noisy based on how many buildings around it have double glazed windows. How on earth will the police know? Is it really fair to put our police in this situation where the law is so peculiar they could interpret it in a million different ways and stand accused of bias one way or another, whatever they do? So I urge ministers to bear in mind the consequences that these provisions will have on the police officers trying to put them into practice on the ground. I give way again.
I'm extremely grateful to the Honourable Lady, if not for allowing me, hopefully, to just enliven our proceedings slightly. But I'm a bit confused, just referring to the Honourable Lady's intervention. She seemed to imply that the Minister in the Welsh Government says there's plenty of legislation to deal with the problem. So is she content in Wales for legislation to be used to control noise in a protest situation, or not?
I think the point that we are trying to make is that with protests there is a balance to be struck between what is reasonable and what is not. And we believe that the right to protest is not an absolute right, that there have to be provisions in place to make sure they are reasonable and do not put out the public in too much of a way. The point with this legislation on noise is it's almost impossible to interpret. It's really unclear. The police haven't asked for it, and the public haven't asked for it, and there are existing rules in place to make sure that a reasonable protest can take place, a reasonable peaceful protest can take place. This rides roughshod over those genuine rights. I will give way.
I thank my
honourable friend for giving way, and she's making really good points, particularly around interpretation. So, for example, in Wirral West, we had a successful campaign against underground coal gasification after the coalition government granted a licence for drilling in the D estuary underneath Ilbury Island. And people were very, very concerned about it. We had a mass demonstration on the beach. One of my concerns is that, of course, when people go to a demonstration, they don't know who else is going to be there. And I'm concerned that people are going to feel intimidated by this law, that maybe they shouldn't attend a protest that they actually would want to attend because of their concerns that they wouldn't be in control of the noise volume once they got there.
I think that's a very interesting and very good point, and thank goodness for those protests and for our right to protest in that way. It's not fair, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's not right to force the police to make political decisions about how much noise is too much noise. Imagine a scenario where two sides of a public debate are protesting, and one group of protesters are on a street where there's lots of double glazing, and the other are on a street where there's old houses and no double glazing. Are we really saying that the police, who might make one protest, who might close one protest for being too noisy, but not the other, would not find themselves in a very difficult political situation with criticism from the public? The government often point to a report by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary that argued that the police needed to better balance the rights of protesters with disruption to the wider public. They asked for a modest reset of the scales, but Inspector Matt Parr, who wrote the report, gave evidence to the Joint Committee on Human Rights and said, and I quote, "Neither the police nor HMIC-FRS have called for a new trigger based on the noise generated by demonstrations." He also said that he was not even asked by the government to look specifically at whether noise should be included or assess whether the change was necessary. The Joint Committee on Human Rights said there was no evidence of a gap in the law that needed to be filled, and that there were already a range of powers to deal with noise that impacts on the rights and freedoms of others. Why on earth is the Home Secretary continuing to push for these powers when the police did not even ask for them? As this bill has progressed through Parliament, we have seen many and various attempts to justify these provisions on noisy protests that no one asked for and no one wants. During Bill Committee, the Minister said the police will impose conditions on the use of noise only in the exceptional circumstances when noise causes unjustifiable disruption, and that the government added the caveat of the word serious, so raising the bar for securing a conviction. And the Minister opposite has said a number of times that the power may only be used in the most exceptional circumstances. But since then, the Ministers have taken away the caveat of the word serious. So the Ministers have lowered the bar. If it doesn't have to be serious alarm or distress, surely the use of these powers might not be in such exceptional circumstances. And the Minister talked about our amendments on PSPOs outside schools and vaccination centres as if that included noise, but in fact the word noise doesn't feature in any of those amendments at all. Our proposal to offer councils fast-track powers to set up protection zones around schools and vaccine clinics is quite different to the government's sweeping powers on protests that could criminalise peaceful protesters singing in the street. The truth is there is a raft of existing powers that police can use, and we do not need these new provisions. The government know it, which is why in this round of ping-pong the government has tabled amendments to review these changes in 2 years' time. But ministers are kidding themselves if they expect a review in 2 years' time to reassure us. So I urge the Minister to scrap this cut and paste job of amendments, to change the guidance that don't make sense and accept Labour's sensible amendments. If I were the Minister opposite, I wouldn't want to be known as the Minister who pushed these provisions on protest through. Is that the legacy he wants? Think of the freedom songs of the civil rights movement, or of the protesters singing the Ukrainian national anthem all over Europe and here on Whitehall. Protest song and the sounds of protest give voice to the voiceless. Let protest annoy us. Let protest be loud. Let us accept that noisy protest can be uncomfortable, Madam Deputy Speaker. The conditions in Part 3 on noise are anti-democratic, and we should all vote to reject them. It would be a great shame if members opposite vote to curtail our freedoms that so many before us have fought for, and which so many more are still fighting for around the world. Thank you.
Sir Mike Penny.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I won't detain the House for very long because the other chamber is doing that. This House has voted with huge majorities to put this legislation through, and the need for it is actually in most of our constituency surgeries, because we listen if the Honourable Lady would just listen for 5 minutes, she might actually hear an argument. If she disagrees with me, that's fine, but chuntering is not probably the answer. One of the biggest things that upsets my constituents is noisy neighbours. Whether it be noise from the music, hard floors upstairs, and my surgeries very often are, how can we control this? Can we have recordings put in by the council? The council work very, very hard to try and address these disputes. That is a small scale, but it means a lot to the individuals that are having their lives blighted by noise. I, as a trade unionist, am more than happy to have demonstrations, legal demonstrations. I think that's part and parcel of the process. And the lady looking at me kind of, I was in the FBU when we were thrown out the Labour Party. So I do have such a bit of a track record here. But to continually blight people's lives, bear with me for a second, continue to blight people's lives because people are exercising their right near their homes or near their offices, day in, day out, is what we're talking about. We're not talking about a demonstration on a beach, to be fair. We're talking about outside, right outside where people live. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. I think the Honourable Member brings a lot of experience to this House. I listened to him carefully. I agree on noisy neighbours. It is a very distressing part of my caseload because very often we struggle really hard to do something about it. This legislation doesn't do anything on that. This is about protest. So it's two completely different things. I think we need to make sure that's really clear. The rules on antisocial behaviour, neighbours, there are powers that local authorities have and the police have to deal with that issue. Sadly, it often doesn't get dealt with, but that isn't the point we're arguing about today.
Respect to the Shadow Minister.
But I just have a little reminder that interventions should be quite brief. Sir Mike Penning.
Thank you very much. I think you made my point exactly, Madam Deputy Speaker. They are different, and I completely agree that this legislation has nothing to do with the principle of noisy neighbours, but that blights people's lives exactly the same as what this legislation is trying to do. And we may disagree, and that's probably right and proper. That's what this place is about. It's about debating. It's not just agreeing with each other all the time. But the principle here has to be that this House, with huge majorities, had voted to do this. And the other House, and I respect a lot of people in the other House, from both sides of the House, they bring a huge amount of experience to the other place, but they're not elected. They should listen to this House with the size of the majority. If the majority was tiny, I think the principle could be argued through, but it's not tiny. It's been voted through. And on that point of view, I completely agree with the Minister, in the position where I used to be.
SNP spokesperson Anne McLaughlin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Throughout the proceedings of this woefully drafted bill, I've maintained that although it's largely reserved to England and Wales, Part 3 on protest will severely restrict anyone from Scotland or indeed anyone from across these islands from exercising their fundamental and democratic right to protest. This is not something that any of us can sit back and allow to happen. What happens here in the coming days will outlive this government, so we will be voting against the government motions to disagree with the Lords, who have worked tirelessly to help restore some balance to the bill. I am seriously concerned about what will happen when this bill is forced through the lobbies. I know that this worries some of the backbenchers opposite who have been lobbying members of the other place to allow the Commons the opportunity to think again on protest measures. It is Part 3 on protest that we're back here for today, and rightly so. The protest measures in this bill have been the headline grabbers, the clauses most briefed on, tweeted on, reported and debated. And most importantly, they are the clauses people are concerned about because they are a threat to a right long held to have our voices heard. My office also receives hundreds of emails on a daily basis asking me to stand up against the threat to these rights. People are worried, and not just because of this bill in particular, although it's frankly terrifying, but because of the context in which it is being pushed through this place. This week sees the Elections Bill, the Nationality and Borders Bill, the Judicial Review and Courts Bill debated, each carrying their own threat to our fundamental rights. People know how this works now. They know that the government have seemingly unfettered powers to make any law they want. Baroness Jones said it best when she said because they have a majority, they can afford not to care about how the bills are written or about their content. And this bill is badly written.
No well-written piece of legislation would require so many amendments that it bordered on the ridiculous. When you're forced to create a database for amendments just to keep track, you know that fundamentally something has gone wrong at the front end. But it's our job to amend, correct and stop badly drafted legislation. And whatever the Minister says, it's the job of the Second House to also have their say on that. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll speak briefly on some specific amendments, but I'd like to make a very general point on all the amendments we're here to discuss. They are cleaning up ambiguous and badly worded clauses that will only force the police, as the Shadow Minister said, into making quasi-political decisions on the spot. Former police chiefs and senior officers have warned against, and I quote, political pressure that this bill will place on frontline officers. It's become apparent through these debates that it's not more legislation or laws that the police need or want. Lord's Amendment 73 would remove sections of the bill that allow the police to intervene and limit processions based on the criteria of noise, and we've heard a lot about that today. And the Government have just got this wrong. They simply have. They've tried to make assurances that powers to act on noise will only be used in the most extreme circumstances, but it's all just too vague. As the Shadow Minister said, what kind of law would ask a frontline police officer to assess the thickness of walls in an office or the kind of glazing in a building prior to intervening on a protest? Seriously, it's in the guidance if members opposite want to check. Here's a quote from the guidance. A noisy protest outside an office with double glazing may not meet the threshold. And it's not just the way in which a building is constructed that frontline officers might have to contend with, it's the duration of the noise, the type of noise, the list goes on. This is ill-conceived, ill-defined, will load pressure onto an already pressurised police force and simply will not work. This is before we get to the crux of the matter, though. Our right to protest is our democratic right. It's not for this government or any successive governments to take that away. We also continue to oppose the government's apparent concession to remove the term serious unease for the simple fact that it's nestled in badly drafted sections and has the unintentional or possibly intentional effect of lowering the threshold for police intervention. Removing the term would lower the threshold of serious alarm or distress to alarm or distress. And my colleague for Cumbernauld, Kilsyth and Kirkintilloch East eloquently made this point in a previous debate, and I stand by his remarks. Madam Deputy Speaker, we supported Lord's Amendment 80 to remove Clause 56 on public assemblies, and we continue to support this amendment. This is yet another clause rife with hidden dangers and attempting to replace public order legislation that is operating perfectly well. The Public Order Act was careful to delineate and differentiate the conditions that could be imposed on static demonstrations as opposed to a march or moving protest, and that was sensible. This reflected the relative ease with which a static demonstration can be policed. The removal...
I'm very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. I understand the Honourable Lady's point, while I am afraid I disagree with it. In Scottish jurisprudence, Scotland has an advantage over England in that it has a well-expressed and commonly used offence of nuisance. Would she support the use of this legislation, Madam Deputy Speaker, in controlling nuisance emanating from a protest?
Well, I think so many of us have already answered this on so many occasions, that there already exists legislation and the powers for the police to control demonstrations that are not peaceful, that are out of control, but we're not talking about that. This legislation allows the police to make decisions on very spurious guidance. Thank you very much. Looking for the word there. And the removal of the distinction about the static demonstration could hand the police unfettered discretion to impose further conditions on static protests, such as the words and slogans that can be used on placards. It's ridiculous. Sometimes they are the best bits. And I really wish I had the time to actually read out some of my favourite words and slogans I've seen recently, but I don't think the government would be too pleased about that. Finally, I want to touch on the Lord's Amendment 87 on one-person protests. This removes the ability of the police to impose conditions on a one-person protest. This was rejected in the last round of ping-pong, and the Lords have rightly asked for this to be reconsidered. And I've twice now heard the Minister talk in derisory terms about the House of Lords, because some of them are hereditary and none of them are elected. So, I mean, the SNP is opposed to the House of Lords on that basis, but his party isn't, and his party puts people in there all the time. So if that's the system that he supports, he can't really complain when they do the job that they're being asked to do? And are we really going to see a law passed today that will allow the might of the state to bear down on a single individual protester? It's ridiculous, it's disproportionate, and it's nothing short of bullying. And be careful, anyone who even stops to chat to a protester, because they could be snared by this clause too. How many times have we all stopped to chat to the wonderful array of protesters outside this place, whether we agree with them or not? Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, doing so could soon see you committing a criminal offence. We're not impressed with the Government's amendments to lay reports before the House. We're not impressed with Government amendments to lay reports before the House with regards to changes to the Public Order Act. They are lip service posing as concessions. They're better than nothing, but they're not much better. I understand that time is short, and I will finish with this. We support the Lords in their amendments and fundamentally disagree with the undemocratic way the Government is throwing its weight around. If the Government is intent on dissuading protest, it is intent on silencing voices. Now, from the huffing and puffing that's been coming from the Minister today, it's clear he is no fan of democracy. So I'm sure he won't mind if I tell him this is undemocratic, unworkable and unfair.
David Simmons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A noise was a common reproof from my mother in my early days, and indeed to my grandchildren from my mum today. And I think we all recognise in the course of the debates that we've had in this House that there are occasions when noise is part of the democratic process and it helps the atmosphere and the challenge, and there are times when it becomes extremely disruptive to the democratic process and begins to get in the way. So I rise to support the Minister and the Government on this particular point. And I'd like to set out very briefly the particular reasons why I take that position. Like the Minister and like a number of colleagues across the House, I've spent a lot of time in local government, and I'm very aware that one of the most common complaints to local authorities is about the disruption which is caused by noise. Now, this particular element of the bill deals with a very specific subset of that noise where it's caused by protests. And I agree with what the Minister and the Government have said. It probably depends very much where in the country you are and what your experience has been. But certainly for local authorities in places, and I speak from experience of a local authority where Heathrow occasioned many protests over the years, that the disruption caused, for example, by relatively low levels of noise, but that carry on for 24 hours a day, sometimes for days and days on end, where extremely loud noises are generated by the kind of portable amplification technology which has become available even to lone protesters today. Those things can cause enormous disruption. And not just disruption to residents who live in those places, and that certainly is something which I appreciate for Central London Members of Parliament has been a very big factor, but also disruption to businesses. And I have many constituents who either work or have business interests in Central London, and if, for example, you are a hotelier, it may be a struggle to sell your hotel rooms in a location where there is constant disruption caused by noisy protests that simply means people cannot sleep, that the normal business of an office is disrupted. And in my view, it is right, given the development of tactics used by some protests, that are aiming specifically to make persistent noisy protests that do not cross the thresholds that are set out in existing legislation, that we need to update the law. And we've heard quite a lot that there are existing powers available, in particular to local authorities, to address the concerns about noise. And that is an argument which certainly I heard at the Joint Committee on Human Rights, and which we've heard in a number of debates about a lot of different aspects of this bill. But it seems to me very clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, that there are occasions when it is not simply the role of the House to respond to what the police are asking for, but to recognise that when constituents, when businesses, when residents are having concerns and are finding that the powers available, for example, to local authorities are not sufficient to remedy the problem that they are experiencing, then it is the duty of this House to consider how we increase the penalties and increase the powers available so that those can be properly addressed. So as this bill contains provisions, for example, to deal with trespass, which crosses a criminal threshold, as it contains powers to increase sentencing, in my view, it is right that it also increases the powers of the police to deal with persistent and noisy protests. Because for those people who are experiencing the disruption to their sleep, the disruption to their family life, the disruption to their business, their normal lawful activity that these types of protests can cause, waiting for the processes which are available to a local authority is simply insufficient. Councils have to go through, by law, various processes to gather evidence. It takes a long time. It can be enormously difficult to identify the cause in a way that meets that legal test. Whereas the police have powers to act when an offence is being committed, to deal with those things and to make sure that those residents, those businesses are no longer being impacted in the way that is simply inappropriate. So for those reasons, and whilst I think it is right that the government have listened to what's been said in the other place about this, I think it is right that we push ahead with this. It will be a relatively narrow subset of occasions when these powers are required. But in my view, the disruption that is caused to businesses, to my constituents' business activities and interests in central London, and to many other people around the country in places like Heathrow, where there can be persistent, long-running protests that cause this kind of disruption, they demonstrate that there is a need for an improvement in the powers, and I wholly support the Minister in defending the dispatch box today.
Beth Winter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We truly are in a remarkable situation of political crisis for this government, and the government seems determined to pursue an assault on the rule of law, democracy, the devolution settlement and human rights. In the week the government intends to prorogue the House, multiple bills are coming before us following repeat government defeats in the Lords. The government seeks to pursue this assault on democracy just a few days after the Prime Minister himself was found to have broken the law. Much of this legislation was not part of the Tory government's election manifesto, and the government cannot therefore claim that it commands the support of the electorate in pursuing this legislation. And with regards to today's amendments, this is certainly the case. Indeed, the mass of public opinion is better demonstrated by the joint coalition of NGOs opposing this bill, which stretches from Amnesty International, 38 Degrees, End Violence Against Women, and many, many more. And it is the Lords who have reflected this civil society concern. I welcome the decision to insist on their amendments which relate to clauses 55 and 61 of this bill. My friend, the noble Lord Corker, the former member for Gedling, when in this House, spoke plainly when the other place considered this bill last. As he highlighted, the government proposals made a bad bill even worse by lowering the threshold from establishing policing powers in relation to serious unease, alarm or distress, to simply alarm or distress, making shut down of protest even more likely. And he highlighted the government's fact sheet guidance for the clauses around too noisy protests make clear this is unworkable and in reality makes protest unpoliceable. If the government can't clarify if a protest would meet the noise threshold under this legislation because of double glazing, it doesn't know what it is doing. Therefore, amidst the confusion, we can only conclude that the government is simply creating powers that can be exploited to shut down noisy protests and scrutiny of the executive. And referring back to the comments earlier with regards to devolution and devolved settlement, I'd like to share with the Minister, if he's not already aware, the Welsh Government has actually withheld legislative consent to sections of the bill that come within their competence, including clauses that relate to the right to protest and noise nuisance. And I've actually got the legislative consent memorandum with me here today if the Minister is interested in seeing this. And the Minister for Social Justice, Jane Hutt, has stated that they wish to send a united message to the UK Government that the eradication of the fundamental right to have our voices heard cannot and will not be tolerated. The Government should and must respect the devolution settlement. There have been 17 bills where Welsh Government have withheld legislative consent so far. 17 bills. Absolutely unacceptable. And indeed, colleagues on the other side reference the police wanting this legislation, where in Wales, police constables have actually expressed significant reservations with the bill in evidence to the Welsh Affairs Committee recently. And I quote, Carl Fawkes of North Wales Police said the police officers could choose not to enforce part of this bill, and Jeremy Vaughan of South Wales Police insisted the protest by its very nature needs to be disruptive, and, to quote, he insisted the most in the police would be vociferously protective of the public's right to protest. As for the Judicial Review and Courts Bill, the Elections Bill and the Nationality and Borders Bill, which we're discussing later this week, it is a government in chaos now.